The air inside the main mess hall at Fort Liberty, North Carolina, was thick enough to chew. It was the kind of heavy, humid Friday evening that only exists in the deep South, where the heat of the day refuses to break even after the sun begins its slow descent behind the pines. For the 200 soldiers packed into the room, the atmosphere was a volatile mix of relief and exhaustion. A grueling week of field training had finally come to a close, and the transition from the disciplined, rain-soaked misery of the woods to the harsh, fluorescent glow of the base was always a jarring experience. It was a time to decompress, to shed the skin of the soldier and reclaim a few hours of the human being underneath. The sounds of the hall were a chaotic symphony of institutional life. There was the rhythmic scrape of metal trays against stainless steel counters, the squeak of combat boots on the worn linoleum floors, and the constant, low-frequency hum of 200 voices competing for space. The smell of industrial-grade cleaning products battled with the heavy aroma of Salisbury steak and overcooked vegetables. In the back of the room, a group of younger privates had propped a phone up against a salt shaker, and a tinny, bass-heavy track was thumping out of a speaker, adding a layer of restless energy to the room. This was the one moment of the week where the rigid hierarchy of the army softened, just for a second. Rank was still there, of course, but the edges were blurred by the shared desire for a hot meal and a few hours of sleep that didn't involve a sleeping bag on frozen ground. Soldiers sprawled in their plastic chairs, their posture a far cry from the at-attention rigidity required hours earlier. They argued over college football scores, traded complaints about their commanding officers in voices that were almost, but not quite, quiet enough to be safe, and scrolled through the week of digital life they had missed while in the field. It was an environment of predictable, comfortable chaos. Nobody expected anything of significance to happen in a mess hall on a Friday night. It was the last place on Earth where anyone looked for a turning point, and that was exactly why the trap worked so well. She appeared near the serving line with the quiet, unassuming grace of a shadow moving across a wall. She didn't announce herself. She didn't barge through the double doors or demand attention. She simply was there, standing slightly apart from the main flow of the crowd like a stone in a rushing stream. Under one arm, she clutched a standard-issue manila transfer packet, its edges slightly frayed. Her uniform jacket was noticeably a size too large, the sleeves hanging just a fraction of an inch too long over her wrists, making her look even smaller than her frame suggested. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail, a few stray strands framing a face that was remarkably calm. She was 28 years old, but she carried the youthful, unlined features of someone in their early 20s. In a room full of people who measured worth by the depth of a person's tan, the number of combat patches on their shoulders, and the particular, weary squint in their eyes, she registered as a total 0. She had no unit patches, no special skill tabs, no jump wings or sibs. She looked like a clerk who had gotten lost on her way to the administrative building, or perhaps a civilian contractor who had borrowed a jacket to ward off the air conditioning. To the casual observer, she was the most unremarkable person in the building. Sergeant Marcus Kaine was not a casual observer. He was a hunter of attention. Marcus Kaine was 34 years old, built like a brick wall, and possessed a voice that seemed to vibrate the very air around him. He had been stationed at Fort Liberty for 3 years, and in that time he had turned the Friday night mess hall into his personal theater. He wasn't a bad soldier by the book, but he was a man who lived for the performance of authority. He knew the layout of every building, the name of every sergeant major in the battalion, and the specific weaknesses of every subordinate he encountered. Most importantly, Marcus Kaine knew how to read a crowd. He knew that after a week of being barked at in the mud, a room full of tired soldiers wanted someone to laugh at. They wanted a distraction, a target that wasn't them. He found his target the moment his eyes landed on the small woman in the oversized jacket. Marcus nudged the man sitting next to him, a heavy-set corporal named Davis. Davis was a man who had built a career out of being the perfect sidekick. He laughed at every joke Marcus told, agreed with every opinion Marcus voiced, and generally functioned as the echo chamber Marcus required to maintain his self-image. Davis looked at the woman, then back at Marcus, and he was already grinning before the sergeant even opened his mouth. He knew exactly what was coming. Marcus Kaine didn't just speak, he projected. He used the voice he had developed on the parade square, a loud, deliberate, crowd-grabbing baritone that cut through the noise of the mess hall like a blade. "Who let the tourist into my mess hall?" The effect was instantaneous. The hum of conversation died. The scraping of trays ceased. 200 heads turned as one toward the serving line. The silence that followed was heavy and expectant. The woman didn't move, she didn't flinch, she didn't even look up at first. She just stood there, staring at the tray in front of her while Marcus Kaine prepared to give his audience the show they were waiting for. Immediately, the phones came out. In the modern military, every moment of conflict is a potential viral video, and the soldiers of Fort Liberty were no exception. They smelled blood in the water, the specific kind of social blood that comes from a high-ranking NCO publicly dismantling a newcomer. Marcus stood up, relishing the feeling of all those eyes on him. It was a physical warmth, a rush of dopamine that came from knowing he was the center of the universe for these 200 people. He began to walk toward her, his boots thudding rhythmically on the linoleum. Every step was a statement of ownership. This was his mess hall, these were his people, and she was an intruder. "Hey," he said, his voice dropping slightly but still carrying to the back rows. "I'm talking to you, you lost sweetheart. The visitors' center is back by the main gate. This is a place for soldiers." The woman finally raised her eyes. When she met Marcus's gaze, her expression wasn't what he expected. He was looking for fear, for the flustered embarrassment of a young private caught out of place. He was looking for the stammering apology he could then tear apart. But what he found was a look of profound, unshakable patience. It was the look a teacher gives a particularly slow student, or perhaps the look a professional athlete gives a heckler in the stands. It was the expression of someone who had seen this movie 1,000 times and already knew how it ended. "No," she said quietly. Her voice was calm and measured. It wasn't a whisper, but it didn't strain to be heard. "I'm exactly where I need to be." Marcus barked a laugh, glancing back at Davis and the others to ensure they were catching this. "Is that right? Because you don't look like you've ever seen a day of service in your life. No patches, no badges, and a jacket that looks like you stole it from your older brother. What's your assignment?" The woman hesitated for a heartbeat. It wasn't the hesitation of someone searching for a lie, but rather the pause of someone deciding exactly how much of the truth the person in front of them could actually handle. "Transfer," she said simply. "Temporary assignment. I arrived this afternoon." "Transfer from where?" Marcus asked, crossing his arms over his broad chest. "That's classified," she replied. The room erupted. A wave of laughter rolled through the mess hall, sharp and mocking. Someone in the back made a loud, whistling sound. "Classified," Davis shouted, slapping the table. "We got a secret agent in the building, boys. Watch out." Marcus leaned in, a predatory smile stretching across his face. "Classified, right. Listen, honey, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but this is Fort Liberty. We don't do mysterious here. In this house, everybody pulls their weight. Everybody earns their place. See these people." He gestured broadly to the room. "They've been in the dirt all week. They've earned the right to sit at these tables. What have you earned?" The woman looked at him steadily, her eyes never wavering. "More than you know," she said. The weight behind those words was enough to cause the laughter to thin out. It didn't disappear, but it became uneasy. A few soldiers exchanged glances, the first seeds of doubt planted in the back of their minds. There was something in the way she stood, the stillness of her hands, the lack of a defensive posture, that didn't align with the image of a tourist. Marcus felt the shift in the room's energy and doubled down. He couldn't afford to lose the crowd now. "More than I know? Okay, let's test that. If you're such a high-speed soldier, let's see what's in that head of yours besides classified secrets." He turned to the room, his arms held wide. "Somebody give me a field manual question. Let's see if our guest can handle the basics." Among the crowd, a young private named Ethan Brooks felt a cold knot of discomfort tightening in his stomach. Ethan was 22, only 8 months out of basic training, and he still remembered the raw vulnerability of being the new person in a hostile environment. But as he watched the woman, he saw things the others were missing. He saw that she wasn't scanning the room for an exit. She wasn't looking for a savior. She was watching Marcus Kaine with the clinical, detached intensity of an engineer looking at a malfunctioning piece of machinery. She was calculating. At the same table as Ethan, Lieutenant Rachel Pierce leaned forward, her eyes bright with a different kind of intensity. Rachel was ambitious and sharp, and she had a particular talent for spotting where the power lay in any given room. She had spent her career aligning herself with the loudest voices, believing it was the only way to survive. She saw Marcus's bullying as a test, and she wanted to see the woman fail. "Ask her about weapons procedures," Rachel suggested, her voice cutting through the noise. FM 322-9. Marcus pointed a finger at the woman. "You heard the lieutenant. FM 322-9. Walk me through the malfunction clearance procedures for an M4 carbine. Right now, go." The woman didn't blink. She reached out and set her transfer packet carefully on the empty space of the counter behind her. She clasped her hands in front of her, and then, without a single visible sign of pressure, she began to speak. The words came out with the precision of a metronome. She didn't stumble over the technical terms. She didn't have to search for the next step. She moved through the sequence of slap, pull, observe, release, tap, and squeeze with a level of detail that went far beyond the standard basic training memorization. She explained the mechanical reason for each action, the physics of the bolt carrier group, and the specific nuances of clearing a double feed under environmental stress. She spoke with the fluency of someone who didn't just know the manual, but who had lived it. She sounded like someone who had cleared malfunctions in the dark, in the rain, while someone was shooting at her. By the time she finished, the room was remarkably quiet. It wasn't the silence of boredom, it was the silence of people realizing they had just witnessed a masterclass. Marcus's smile remained on his face, but it had become a mask. The confidence in his eyes had flickered, replaced by a frantic need to re-establish dominance. "Lucky guess," he said, his voice a bit too loud. "You memorized the book. Big deal. Any admin clerk can read a manual. Let's get real." He looked at the back of the room. "Somebody else? Tactical." A voice called out from the back, a weathered sergeant who had been watching from the shadows. "Land navigation. No GPS. Terrain association only. How do you find your position in a dense canopy?" She answered immediately, her voice never losing its calm, rhythmic quality. She spoke of contour lines, of the subtle ways water drainage patterns reveal the slope of the land, of using the stars when the canopy breaks and the moss when it doesn't. She described phase line identification, casualty assessment under fire, and the exact immediate action drills for an ambush from the right. Each question was met with a perfect, unhurried response. The energy in the room was cooling rapidly. The soldiers who had been laughing moments ago were now leaning in, their expressions shifting from mockery to a confused, growing respect. They were starting to realize that the person standing before them was not a tourist. They were starting to realize that Marcus Kaine might have picked a fight with something he didn't understand. Marcus knew it too. He could feel the room slipping away from him. Every correct answer was a brick removed from the pedestal he had built for himself. This mess hall was his stage, and she was stealing the spotlight without even trying. He felt a tightness in his chest, a burgeoning sense of panic that he tried to smother with aggression. He stepped closer to her, closing the gap until he was well within her personal space. "Okay," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. The performance was gone now, replaced by something much uglier. "You know your procedures, good for you, you've got a good memory, but procedures can be faked. What you can't fake is time in the shit, what you can't fake is the scars." He looked down at her, his eyes narrowed. "How many deployments?" The woman looked up at him, and for the first time, a shadow of something like pity crossed her face. "That's classified," she said again, but this time nobody laughed. The word classified no longer sounded like a pathetic excuse. It sounded like a warning. Marcus's jaw tightened so hard the muscles in his neck stood out. "Classified," he repeated, the word tasting like poison. "Everything with you is classified. Your transfer, your assignment, your deployments. What kind of soldier shows up to a base with no record, no patches, and claims everything is secret? I'll tell you what kind. The kind who's hiding the fact that they haven't done a damn thing." "I am the kind of soldier," she said, her voice dropping even lower, "whose records you do not have the security clearance to access." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that rings in the ears. Even the music in the back had stopped. 200 soldiers sat frozen, forks halfway to their mouths, as they watched the sergeant and the nameless woman lock eyes. Ethan Brooks sat his fork down with a trembling hand. He looked at Marcus and saw a man who was drowning in his own ego. Then he looked at the woman and saw a predator. He realized with a sudden and terrifying clarity that she wasn't defending herself. She wasn't a victim of a bully. She was an operator, and she was letting Marcus destroy himself. Marcus, however, was too far gone to see the exit ramp. He felt the weight of 200 people watching him, waiting for him to either win or fold, and Marcus Kaine did not fold. "I want to see your transfer orders," he snapped. "Right now." "You don't have the authority to demand them," she replied. "I have the authority to question a suspicious presence on this installation. I'm a sergeant in the United States Army, and you're a nobody in a jacket that doesn't fit. Then get someone who outranks you to make the request," she said calmly. She reached out, picked up her transfer packet, and turned toward the serving line as if the conversation were over. As if Marcus Kaine simply no longer existed in her world. That was the moment the last of Marcus's composure snapped. Being ignored was worse than being insulted. Being dismissed in front of his audience was an ego death he couldn't survive. "Don't you walk away from me," he barked. She stopped. She didn't jump, she didn't startle. She simply paused and turned back with a slow, deliberate motion. The expression on her face was still that same patient, measuring look. "Sergeant," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it seemed to fill every corner of the room. "I have been standing here for the last 20 minutes. I have answered your questions. I have been patient with your insults. I have been polite in the face of your harassment. I have done all of this in front of your audience and their cameras." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "But I want to ask you something, and I want you to think very, very carefully before you answer." Marcus said nothing, his chest heaving with silent rage. "If you didn't know who I was," she asked, "why didn't I deserve basic respect?" The question was a physical blow. It didn't just target Marcus. It hit every person in the room who had laughed, every person who had pulled out a phone to record a humiliation, every person who had stayed silent while a fellow soldier was being bullied. It was a question that stripped away the ranks and the patches and the bravado, leaving only the raw, uncomfortable truth of their behavior. Ethan Brooks felt the blood rush to his face. He looked at his lap, unable to meet the woman's gaze. He looked at Davis, who was staring at his feet, and at Rachel Pierce, whose sharp, ambitious smile had vanished, replaced by a look of sudden, sharp realization. Marcus struggled to find his footing. His mind was racing, trying to find a way to flip the script, to regain the high ground. He reached for the only tool he had left, more aggression. He forced a smile, though it looked more like a grimace. "You want respect. You earn it the way the rest of us did," he said, his voice regaining some of its theatrical volume. He gestured at her jacket. "And you can start by taking off that ridiculous coat. Let's see what's actually under there. If you're such a legendary soldier, you've got something to show for it. If you don't, well, then we all know exactly what you are. A fake. A fraud." A murmur rippled through the crowd. This was going too far. Taking off a uniform jacket in a mess hall was a minor thing, but the context made it feel like a violation. "Sergeant Kaine." The voice came from Ethan Brooks. He stood up, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He was terrified, his hands shaking at his sides, but he couldn't stay silent anymore. "Maybe we should just—" "I mean, she's answered everything. Maybe that's enough, Sergeant." Marcus turned a look of pure, unadulterated venom on the young private. "Nobody asked you, Private. Sit down and shut up before you find yourself pulling extra duty until you retire." Ethan sat down, his face burning, but he had done it. He had spoken. The woman looked at him for a brief second, and for the first time her expression softened. It was a look of recognition, a silent acknowledgement of a person who had done the right thing even when it was difficult. Then she turned back to Marcus. "You want me to remove my jacket?" she asked. "That's what I said," Marcus replied, emboldened by his silencing of Ethan. "In front of everyone, nothing to hide, right? Unless there is something." The room was held in a state of suspended animation. The air seemed to have been sucked out of the hall. 200 people watched as the woman reached for the zipper of her oversized jacket. There was no hesitation in her movements. Her hands were perfectly steady. It wasn't the steadiness of someone trying to appear brave. It was the clinical, practiced steadiness of a professional. She slipped the jacket off one shoulder, then the other, and folded it with a strange, quiet reverence over the counter. Underneath, she wore a standard-issue olive drab undershirt. It was tight-fitting, revealing a physique that was far more athletic and powerful than her small frame had suggested. Every muscle in her arms was defined, the lean, functional strength of a high-endurance athlete. She turned her back to Marcus and the room. She reached for the hem of the olive shirt and lifted it just enough to reveal the skin of her back. And the world stopped. Across the full width of her back, stretching from the nape of her neck to the small of her spine and from shoulder blade to shoulder blade, was a tattoo. It was rendered in deep blacks and shimmering silvers, a work of art that looked less like ink and more like a part of her anatomy. It was a dragon, its body coiled in a complex ancient pattern, its wings unfurled as if ready to take flight. The level of detail was staggering. Each scale was distinct, The eyes of the beast seemed to glow with a hidden fire, and the claws looked sharp enough to draw blood. But it wasn't the artistry that caused the room to go cold. It was the meaning. In the back of the room, 3 men went completely still. They were older, more seasoned than the rest. They were the ones who had spent years in the shadows, the ones who had served in locations unknown, and whose missions didn't get turned into movies. One of them, a master sergeant named Holloway, felt the blood drain from his face so quickly he thought he might faint. Holloway had seen that mark once before. He had seen it on the arm of a man in a dusty village in a country that didn't technically exist. He knew what it was. It wasn't just a tattoo. It was a dragon mark. It was the identifier for a specific, highly classified tier of operators within the special operations community. It was a symbol for those who didn't exist, who performed the tasks that were too dark for the regular military, and whose very names were removed from the census. Marcus Kaine was staring at the tattoo, but he didn't understand it. He saw a dragon, and he saw a woman who had a lot of ink, and he was already preparing a comment about unauthorized body art. He was opening his mouth to speak, to deliver the final blow to her reputation, when the double doors at the front of the mess hall slammed open. The sound was like a gunshot. Colonel David Mitchell, the commanding officer of the entire installation, walked into the room. Mitchell was a man who commanded respect without ever having to raise his voice. He was a veteran of 3 wars, a man whose chest was a tapestry of ribbons and medals, and who had the kind of presence that could silence a room by simply being in it. He had been alerted to a disturbance in the mess hall 10 minutes ago. He had expected a fight between privates or perhaps a heated argument between NCOs. He had come to restore order, but as he stepped into the room, he saw the woman. He saw the dragon on her back, and Colonel David Mitchell did something that no one in the room had ever seen him do. He didn't yell. He didn't demand an explanation. He didn't even look at Marcus Kaine. The colonel stopped. He squared his shoulders, his spine snapping into a line of perfect, rigid steel. His heels clicked together on the linoleum, and with a movement that was both formal and deeply respectful, he raised his hand to his brow and snapped to attention. He saluted. The mess hall was so quiet you could hear the hum of the refrigerators in the kitchen. 200 soldiers watched, their brains struggling to process the image of a full colonel saluting a woman in an undershirt. Mitchell's voice, when he spoke, was a clarion call that cut through the silence. Lieutenant Ava Morgan, Navy SEAL Team 6, call sign Dragon Ghost. The names hit the room like physical objects. SEAL Team 6, Dragon Ghost, the legends, the ghosts. The people who were responsible for the missions that changed the course of history but never made the news. Phones were lowered. Trays were forgotten. The soldiers who had been laughing moments ago now looked like they wanted the ground to open up and swallow them whole. Marcus Kaine felt the air leave his lungs. He felt his entire world, the theater he had built for himself, the hierarchy he had exploited, and the confidence he had worn like armor crumble into dust. He stood in the middle of the room, a man who had tried to humiliate a legend, and he realized he was the only one who had been humiliated. Lieutenant Ava Morgan lowered her shirt and turned around. She didn't look at the colonel yet. She looked at Marcus. She looked at him with that same patient, measuring expression she had worn from the very beginning. It was the look of a person who had seen the worst the world had to offer and had survived it, and who found a bullying sergeant in a mess hall to be nothing more than a minor, tedious distraction. She picked up her jacket, slid it back on, and zipped it up. She looked at Ethan Brooks and gave him a single, barely perceptible nod of the head, a gesture of respect from one soldier to another. Then she turned to Colonel Mitchell and returned the salute. "Reporting for duty, Colonel," she said. The mess hall finally exhaled, but it was a cold, shaky breath. The Friday evening had changed. The atmosphere of relaxed exhaustion was gone, replaced by a profound, echoing realization. They had walked into a trap, but it wasn't a trap of her making. It was a trap made of their own arrogance, their own lack of respect, and their own willingness to follow a loud voice into a dark place. Ava Morgan picked up her transfer packet and walked toward the exit. The crowd parted for her like the Red Sea. No one spoke. No one moved. They just watched her go, the small woman in the oversized jacket who had taught 200 soldiers a lesson they would never, ever forget. As she reached the doors, she paused and looked back one last time. Not at Marcus, who was still standing frozen in the center of the room, but at the room as a whole. "Next time," she said, her voice soft but perfectly clear, "remember why you put on the uniform." And then she was gone, disappearing into the humid North Carolina night, leaving behind a silence that would last long after the lights in the mess hall were turned off. Marcus Kaine remained where he was, his performance finally over, standing alone in the center of a room that no longer belonged to him. The phones remained dark, the laughter was dead, and for the 200 soldiers of Fort Liberty, the weekend had officially begun, but not a single one of them felt like celebrating. In the corner, Ethan Brooks sat down and picked up his fork. His hand was no longer shaking. He looked at the empty space where the woman had stood, and then he looked at his fellow soldiers. He saw the shame in their eyes, the same shame he felt in his own chest. But he also felt something else. He felt a sense of clarity. He had seen what real strength looked like, and it didn't look like Marcus Kaine. It didn't look like patches or medals or loud voices. It looked like a dragon hiding under a too large jacket, waiting patiently for the rest of the world to catch up. The colonel stayed for a moment, his eyes lingering on Marcus with a look that promised a very long, very difficult conversation in the near future. Then he too turned and left. Outside, the crickets were beginning their nightly chorus, and the distant sound of a bugle playing taps drifted across the base. It was the end of the day, the end of the week, and for many in that room, the end of the people they used to be. The story of the dragon ghost would be told for years at Fort Liberty, whispered in the barracks and shared over campfires in the field. It would become a legend, a warning, and a reminder. But for Ava Morgan, it was just another Friday. She had a mission to start, a record to keep classified, and a world to protect. A world that, for the most part, would never even know she was there. And that was exactly how she wanted it. She didn't need the patches. She didn't need the applause. She had the mark on her back and the knowledge in her heart, and in the end, that was the only thing that had ever mattered. The mess hall slowly began to clear. Soldiers moved in silence, their heads down, their voices hushed. The tinny music was gone. The bravado was extinguished. As the last of them filtered out into the night, the linoleum floor stood empty, reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights above. The only thing left was the lingering scent of cleaning products and the heavy, undeniable weight of a truth that had finally been told. Marcus Kaine was the last to leave. He walked out of the double doors, his shoulders slumped, his gaze fixed on the ground. He didn't look like a king anymore. He looked like a man who had finally realized how small he truly was. And as he stepped out into the dark, the quiet of the base swallowed him whole, leaving nothing behind but the legend of the woman who had walked into his mess hall and changed everything. The silence did not descend all at once. It wasn't a sudden, jarring vacuum, but rather something more organic and unsettling. The slow, rhythmic release of pressure from a container that had been sealed far too tight for far too long. In the vast, utilitarian expanse of the mess hall, the sounds of 200 people trying to find their bearings began to leak into the air. It started with the subtle shift of bodies in plastic seats, the rhythmic creak of weight being redistributed as soldiers realized they were no longer watching a routine confrontation, but a historic collapse. Metal trays, once heavy with the remains of Friday night's dinner, clinked against laminate tables with a sound that felt unnecessarily loud, like a bell tolling in a cathedral. Near the back of the room, someone let out a dry, nervous cough that echoed against the high rafters. These were ordinary sounds, the mundane background noise of military life, yet in that specific moment, they felt enormous. They were the sounds of a crowd attempting to locate themselves in a reality that had just shifted several degrees without warning. Marcus Kaine had not moved. He remained anchored to the center of the room, his body frozen in the exact position he had occupied when Colonel Mitchell had stepped through the double doors. He was still standing where he had been when the salute happened, when that name, Lieutenant Ava Morgan, had landed in the room with the force of a kinetic strike. His arms were held stiffly at his sides, his fingers curled into loose, useless fists. His jaw was set so tightly that the muscles in his neck stood out like corded steel. From a distance, to a casual observer, he might have appeared composed, a veteran sergeant maintaining his military bearing under pressure. But from the perspective of Ethan Brooks, sitting just 2 rows away, the facade was transparent. Ethan watched the color drain from Marcus's face and saw a man standing on the surface of a frozen lake that had just splintered beneath his boots. Marcus was waiting, suspended in a moment of terrifying physics, to see if the ice would hold or if the dark water would finally claim him. Ethan felt no satisfaction in the sight. Instead, he felt a tight, coiling dread in his stomach, the kind of discomfort that comes from watching something powerful being systematically dismantled. Colonel Mitchell crossed the room with a deliberate, measured pace. He was a man who understood the theater of command, choosing every step as if he were navigating a minefield where the mines were psychological rather than explosive. He stopped directly in front of Ava, ignoring the 200 pairs of eyes tracking his every move. When he looked at her, his expression was a complex map of professional respect and something else, something that looked remarkably like a sincere apology. He didn't speak loudly, but in the hushed mess hall, his voice carried to every corner. He apologized for what had happened that night, speaking on behalf of the entire installation. He spoke with the weight of a man who realized that a failure of leadership had occurred under his watch, a failure that had allowed a wolf to be baited by those who mistook her for prey. Ava looked at him with a terrifyingly calm demeanor. There was no triumph in her eyes, no smugness at having been validated by the highest-ranking officer on the base. She stood with her posture relaxed, her oversized jacket still hanging off her shoulders, yet she looked more in command than anyone else in the building. She thanked the colonel for his sentiment but told him, quite simply, that the apology wasn't necessary yet. She paused, letting the words hang in the air before adding that they were not finished. Mitchell's eyes flickered briefly toward Marcus, a quick, sharp assessment before returning to Ava. He nodded once, a sharp movement of the chin that signaled his total surrender of the room. By stepping back, he was giving her the floor. In that moment, every person watching understood that the hierarchy of Fort Liberty had been temporarily suspended. Whatever happened next was entirely in her hands. Marcus understood it too. He could feel the gravity of the room shifting, the invisible lines of loyalty and fear realigning themselves away from him, and toward the woman he had spent the last hour trying to humiliate. The authority he had spent years cultivating, the sense of absolute power he wielded over the junior enlisted, and the respect he commanded from his peers, had simply evaporated. It had transferred to her as if it had never truly belonged to him at all. It had been a loan, and the bank was now calling it in. The realization didn't humble him. It ignited a desperate, white-hot anger. Marcus Kaine had spent his entire adult life building a fortress in rooms exactly like this one. It wasn't just a military career he was protecting. It was something far more fragile and personal. He had crafted a role for himself where the space rearranged itself whenever he entered it. He was the man people listened to, the man whose presence carried an unspoken weight. And in 20 minutes, a woman he had dismissed as a drifter had taken every brick of that fortress apart without even raising her voice. He couldn't let it go. He needed the room back. He needed the air. "This is a setup," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. It was loud, projecting a confidence he no longer felt, designed to hook the attention of the crowd and drag it back to his side. He looked at Colonel Mitchell, his eyes wide with a frantic sort of intensity. He questioned the reality of it all, the transfer, the orders, the tattoo. He asked, with a veneer of respect that fooled no one, how they could be sure any of this was real. He suggested she was a scammer, someone who had memorized military protocols from the internet and paid a tattoo artist to mimic a legendary mark. He was throwing pebbles at a tank, but the room stirred. It wasn't agreement that moved through the soldiers, but the particular, nervous energy of uncertainty. Doubt is a viral thing. Once it's introduced into a crowd, it spreads faster than any certainty ever could. It doesn't require evidence or logic. It only needs a voice willing to give it a shape and a name. Ava didn't interrupt him. She let him finish his desperate gambit, waiting for 2 full beats of silence after he stopped speaking. The silence was tactical, a vacuum that made Marcus's outburst seem even more hollow than it already was. When she finally moved, it was to look at Colonel Mitchell. She asked for access to a secure line, requesting that the call be placed on speakerphone so that everyone in the room could hear it. Mitchell looked at her carefully, his mind racing through the implications. When she told him who she wanted him to call, his face didn't change, but something moved behind his eyes, a rapid internal recalibration. It was the look of a man suddenly realizing the sheer scale of the situation he was standing in. He told her he needed 5 minutes and walked out of the mess hall. Those 5 minutes were the longest of Ethan Brooks's life. The mess hall didn't return to the normal hum of conversation. No one went back to their food. No one checked their phones. The room was in a state of suspended animation, a crowd waiting for a verdict that they knew would define the base for a long time to come. Marcus remained where he was, though he looked increasingly isolated. His friend Davis had quietly moved away from him at some point, a silent, unannounced retreat. People have an instinct for moving away from things they no longer wish to be associated with, and Davis was exercising that instinct with surgical precision. Marcus noticed the desertion but said nothing. He crossed his arms, staring at the far wall with the fixed, glassy expression of a man rehearsing arguments that he was no longer sure would land. Across the room, Rachel Pierce had pulled her chair back from her table. She was remarkably still, her face a mask of neutrality that betrayed how hard she was working to hide her internal state. Rachel wasn't a person who defaulted to being neutral. She was a person of action and opinion. For her to be this still meant she was terrified. Ethan looked back at Ava. She had picked up her transfer packet from the counter and was holding it with both hands, her posture relaxed and unhurried. She wasn't watching Marcus, and she wasn't watching the door. She seemed to be looking at a point in the middle distance, existing in a space between the present and the future with the patience of someone who understands that time, when used properly, is a tool rather than an obstacle. Ethan thought back to the moment he had spoken up. He remembered how his voice had sounded, clumsy, far too loud, and utterly ignored by the people who mattered. He had tried to tell Marcus that she had answered enough questions, that they should just let it go. It had achieved nothing in the moment except earning him 4 seconds of Marcus's dangerous, predatory attention. But Ava had looked at him afterward, a brief glance that had made those 4 seconds of fear feel entirely worth it. He didn't know why, but in that look, he had felt seen in a way he hadn't since arriving at the installation. The heavy doors swung open again, and Colonel Mitchell returned, carrying a field communications tablet. He walked to the center of the mess hall, standing near Ava, and held the device up so the speaker faced the room. He issued a grim warning. This was a secure line, and nothing heard in this room was to leave the installation. 200 heads nodded in unison, a wave of silent compliance. Mitchell pressed a button, and a voice filled the space. It wasn't a voice anyone recognized, but it possessed a quality of authority so dense it was almost physical. It was the voice of someone who existed at an echelon of the military hierarchy that most people in that room would never even glimpse from a distance. The voice addressed the colonel, acknowledging a situation regarding the credentials of Lieutenant Morgan. When the voice asked who was raising the questions, Mitchell's gaze shifted to Marcus. Every eye in the room followed. Marcus held his ground, though his breathing had become shallow. He identified himself, but the voice on the line cut him off, saying his name with the flat, clinical precision of someone reading a line from a casualty report. The voice told him, in no uncertain terms, that Ava Morgan's service record was classified at a level far above the clearance of anyone in that room, including the commanding officer. The voice spoke of operations that had preserved lives on multiple continents, and a designation held by fewer than a dozen active personnel in the entire United States military. Then came the ultimatum. If Marcus wanted to pursue a formal inquiry, he could. But the process would take 4 months. The voice asked, with a chilling lack of emotion, if the sergeant wanted to wait 4 months. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy in the ears. Marcus's throat moved as he swallowed hard. His voice was a thin shadow of its former self when he finally managed to say, "No, sir." The voice on the line didn't offer comfort. It suggested that Marcus take the next few minutes to think very carefully about the decisions he had made that evening, because someone was already thinking about them with a great deal of scrutiny. The line clicked shut. The screen went dark. Colonel Mitchell lowered the tablet slowly, his face grim. The silence was different now. It was no longer the silence of anticipation. It was the silence of the aftermath. It was the quiet that settles over a landscape after a storm has passed, leaving behind a trail of irreversible damage. Marcus Kaine was still standing, his body maintaining its position because his nerves hadn't yet processed the reality his mind was reeling from. But his face had changed. The performance was gone. The swagger, the calculated charm, the practiced authority, all of it had been stripped away. What remained was something raw and honest, a look of profound, high-speed realization. He looked like a man who had been sprinting toward a goal only to realize at the last second that he was running off a cliff. Ethan Brooks let out a long, shaky breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Rachel Pierce was staring intently at the floor, as if trying to memorize the pattern of the tiles. Ava waited until the silence had fully permeated the room, until everyone was sitting inside it together. Then she spoke. She didn't raise her voice, but the name Sergeant Kaine sounded like a gunshot. When Marcus looked at her, she gave him a simple instruction: sit down. It wasn't a barked command or a polite suggestion. It was something in between, a quiet directive that carried more weight than any shout because it didn't need volume to enforce itself. Marcus sat. He didn't protest. He didn't look for an escape. He simply collapsed into his seat. Ava then turned her attention to the entire room. She told them she wanted them to listen carefully because she wouldn't be repeating herself. She spoke about the universal experience of being underestimated, of walking into a space, and having people decide who you are before you've even opened your mouth. She spoke about how people are judged for their age, their origins, or their appearance. She told them that some of them were underestimating people at that very moment in their own units, and that they were doing damage they couldn't yet see, but which was undeniably real. She revealed that the evening had not been an accident. She hadn't ended up in that mess hall by a twist of fate. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. The entire confrontation had been an assessment, part of a 3-month program evaluating leadership culture at the unit level across multiple installations. It wasn't about formal reviews or scheduled evaluations. It was about seeing what leaders do when they think no one important is watching. It was about observing what happens when power believes it is protected from consequences. The sentence landed heavily, shifting the perspective of everyone in the room. They weren't just witnesses to a fight. They were participants in a diagnostic test that they had, largely, failed. Marcus Kaine looked up, his face transitioning from shock to a more profound kind of questioning. For the first time in years, he was being forced to look into a mirror he hadn't asked for. Colonel Mitchell clarified that this had been a formal assessment, and Ava confirmed it. The word information hung in the air like smoke. Marcus understood that this wasn't just a personal embarrassment, it was documentation. It was a record that now existed at a level of the military that he couldn't even reach. He asked, speaking to the colonel but looking at Ava, what would happen next. Ava told him that it depended entirely on him, that what he did in the next few minutes would matter more than everything he had done in the previous 20. Ethan watched as Marcus struggled with that sentence. He saw the different versions of the man, the performer, the leader, the bully, flicker across his face in rapid succession before settling into something quieter and more uncomfortable. Marcus looked at his hands, then at the room full of people waiting to see if he would be brave or small. Finally, he looked at Ava and admitted that he had made a decision about her in 3 seconds based on nothing real. He confessed that every time she had proven him wrong, he had made it worse because he couldn't let it go in front of everyone. He couldn't just stop. Ava didn't make him grovel. She told him he didn't need to explain the psychology to her. She understood it better than he did. She just needed to know if he understood it. Marcus's response was a simple, exhausted, "Yeah, I think I'm starting to." It wasn't a grand speech or a dramatic movie moment. It was the sound of a man putting down a weight he had been carrying for a very long time and finally feeling how much it had been costing him. Across the room, Rachel Pierce's knuckles were white as she gripped the table. She looked at Ava for 3 seconds before turning away, a silent acknowledgement of her own reckoning. Ethan realized that Rachel's journey would be different from Marcus's, quieter, more private, but perhaps even more complex because of the specific choices she had made. Then, Ava called Ethan's name. His spine straightened instantly. He hadn't expected to be noticed, let alone addressed. He felt the weight of 200 pairs of eyes as Ava asked him why he had spoken up earlier. Ethan struggled for a moment, trying to find an answer that sounded professional, but eventually settled on the truth. It felt wrong, and he thought someone should say so, even if it didn't change anything. Ava told him that was the most important leadership instinct in the room. She told him that the instinct to say something is wrong, even when it costs you, is rarer than he might think. She told him not to let anyone train it out of him. In the back of the room, Master Sergeant Holloway, the man who had recognized the dragon tattoo, let out a slow breath. He had been in the army for nearly 2 decades and had seen this same pattern play out countless times, the cruelty of authority and the silence of the witnesses. He looked at the young private and felt a mixture of admiration and shame. He made a silent decision about how he would handle the next room he walked into, the next time that calculation presented itself. Colonel Mitchell stepped forward one last time. He took full responsibility for the culture on the base, admitting that he had failed to build the right one. He promised a full review of leadership practices starting the following week. He looked at Ava and told her he had a great deal of work to do. She nodded, expressing a genuine belief in his words that seemed to give the colonel a new sense of purpose. Ava picked up her jacket and put it on. She gathered her things and looked around the room one final time, cataloging the faces and the atmosphere. She didn't look satisfied. She looked like someone who had just finished a difficult but necessary job. As she walked toward the door with Mitchell, she paused at the threshold. Without turning around, she left them with one final thought: that leadership isn't about what you do when people are watching, but what you do when you think they aren't. She disappeared into the night, leaving the mess hall in a silence that felt different from any that had come before. It was a silence filled with the weight of introspection. The room emptied slowly. Usually on a Friday night, the soldiers would be rushing out, their voices echoing in the hallways as they headed toward their weekend plans. Tonight, they moved in small groups or alone, their footsteps soft on the linoleum. No one talked. The quiet spoke volumes about the impact of what they had witnessed. Ethan Brooks stood up and carried his tray to the return window. His mind was a whirlwind of the night's events, but his hands were steady. He kept thinking about the way Ava had said his name. He had expected to spend his time at Fort Liberty being invisible, just another low-ranking soldier in a sea of uniforms. Instead, he had been validated by a legend. He was still trying to figure out what that meant for his future. Marcus Kaine was the last to leave. He sat at his table long after the lights had been dimmed and the cleaning staff had begun their work. They moved around him, sensing the gravity of his isolation. He was thinking about the voice on the phone, the way it had said his name. It wasn't just the words, it was the realization that he was no longer the one who defined the room. He was just a line in a report, a man who had been weighed, measured, and found wanting. He sat there in the dim light, staring at his hands, realizing that while the evening was over, the real work of his life had only just begun. The mess hall, once a theater of conflict, was now just a room again. The smell of industrial cleaner and stale air lingered, but the tension had dissipated, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. The soldiers walking back to their barracks looked at the stars differently that night. They looked at each other differently. The assessment was over, but the lessons were just beginning to sink in. In the quiet of the barracks, as boots were unlaced and lights were turned off, the memory of the woman in the oversized jacket remained. A reminder that power is fleeting, respect is earned, and the most important things happen in the moments when we think no one is looking. Ethan lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling. He could still hear the clatter of the trays and the calm, steady voice of Lieutenant Morgan. He thought about the dragon tattoo and the classified records, but mostly he thought about the feeling of standing up when everyone else was sitting down. He realized that the world was much larger and much more complicated than he had imagined when he enlisted. There were forces at work that he didn't understand, people who moved in the shadows to protect the very thing he was a part of. He felt a new sense of responsibility, a weight that wasn't heavy, but grounding. Outside, the base was still. The rhythmic pulse of the perimeter lights flickered against the dark horizon. Somewhere in the administrative heart of the installation, Colonel Mitchell was likely already beginning the work he had promised. Somewhere else, Ava Morgan was probably already moving on to the next assessment, the next room, the next group of people who would underestimate her. And in the center of it all, the soldiers of Fort Liberty slept, their dreams haunted by the image of a mirror they hadn't known was being held up to their souls. As the hours crept toward dawn, the events of the evening began to crystallize into the lore of the base. It would be talked about in whispers for years. The night the ghost came to dinner. It would become a cautionary tale for some and an inspiration for others. But for those who were actually there, it would always be something more than a story. It would be the moment they realized that the uniform doesn't make the leader, and that the truth has a way of finding its way into the light, no matter how much shadow you try to throw over it. The sun began to rise over the pine trees, casting long, thin shadows across the parade grounds. The first bugle call of the morning broke the stillness, calling the base to life. Men and women climbed out of their bunks, dressed in their fatigues, and stepped out into the cool morning air. They moved with a slightly different cadence, a subtle shift in their posture. They were the same people they had been 24 hours ago, but they were also fundamentally changed. The world had shifted, and they were still finding their footing in the new landscape. In the mess hall, the morning shift of cooks began preparing breakfast. The smell of bacon and coffee replaced the lingering scent of floor wax. The tables were clean, the chairs were tucked in, and the floor was swept. There was no physical evidence of the previous night's drama, no scars on the walls or stains on the floor. But as the first few soldiers trickled in for their morning meal, they paused at the entrance, their eyes instinctively drifting toward the center of the room. They looked at the spot where the table had been, where the sergeant had stood, where the woman had turned the world upside down. Then they moved toward the food line, quieter than usual, their minds already working on the choices they would make that day. The assessment was over, but the real test, the one that happened every single day in the quiet moments of their lives, was just beginning. Marcus Kaine walked into the mess hall near the end of the breakfast shift. He didn't head for the center table. He didn't scan the room for an audience. He took a tray, moved through the line without a word, and found a quiet corner in the back. He ate his meal in silence, looking at no one. Some people watched him, expecting the old Marcus to reappear, but he remained focused on his food. When he was finished, he cleared his tray and walked out, his shoulders set, his gaze forward. He wasn't the man he had been, and he wasn't yet the man he was going to be. He was somewhere in the middle, in the uncomfortable, honest space of a person who has finally stopped running. Ethan Brooks saw him leave. He was sitting with a few other privates, and for the first time they were talking about things that mattered, about what it meant to be a good soldier, about the difference between authority and leadership. Ethan didn't feel invisible anymore. He felt like a part of something, a cog in a machine that was finally being greased and repaired. He looked at the door through which Ava Morgan had disappeared and felt a quiet sense of gratitude. She had come to their base to look for flaws, but in doing so, she had shown them their potential. She had given them a chance to be better, and as the morning sun flooded the mess hall, Ethan Brooks decided he was going to take it. The way your own name sounds when it is stripped of its power is a sound you never forget. For Marcus Kaine, his name had always been a blunt instrument, a heavy weight that preceded him into any room he entered. It was a word that carried the accumulated force of his rank, his years of service, and the sheer momentum of a personality that demanded to be the center of gravity. But hearing it spoken by Ava Morgan in that quiet, clinical register had been like looking into a mirror he didn't know existed and seeing a stranger staring back. It wasn't just that she had dismissed him, it was that she had categorized him. He had been reduced from a man of consequence to a mere notation in a file, a data point in a larger, more troubling trend. When the mess hall finally cleared and the echoes of the evening's confrontation began to settle into the floorboards, Marcus pushed his chair back with a slow, grinding scrape. He stood up, his joints feeling stiff, and walked out into the cool, biting night air of Fort Liberty. He stood there on the gravel, alone in the dark, with nothing to perform for and nobody left to manage. There was a specific bone-deep exhaustion that comes with holding something very heavy for a very long time and suddenly being forced to set it down. The silence of the base at night was immense, punctuated only by the distant hum of a generator and the rhythmic thrum of his own heartbeat. 3 hours later, the lights were still burning in Colonel Mitchell's office. The air inside was thick with the smell of old coffee and the ozone scent of a laptop that had been running too hot for too long. Ava sat across from Mitchell, her posture as straight and unyielding as the assessment framework she was currently navigating. Between them, the screen of a secure laptop threw a pale, flickering blue light over a mountain of paperwork. She was walking him through the data with the methodical precision of a surgeon, her voice a steady, rhythmic drone that cut through the silence of the building. Outside the window, the base had settled into its nighttime rhythms. Every so often, the distant sound of tires on gravel signaled a vehicle making its rounds, or a stray voice would drift up from the barracks. But mostly there was just the particular quality of silence that belongs to large institutional spaces after hours. A silence that feels like it's waiting for something to break. Mitchell had his reading glasses perched on the bridge of his nose, his eyes fixed on the assessment criteria. He was studying the screen with the focused, pained attention of a man who is learning things about his own command that he should have already known. He was trying to figure out how to metabolize this new, bitter information responsibly. "How long have you been watching?" Mitchell asked, his voice gravelly from hours of talk. Formally, 72 hours, Ava replied, her eyes never leaving the screen. Informally, "I've been reading incident reports and conduct records for 3 weeks before my arrival on site." Mitchell looked up, the frames of his glasses catching the lamplight. "And what did those records tell you?" "That the problem wasn't new," she said. She didn't blink, holding his gaze with a terrifying level of transparency. The complaint patterns go back 14 months, Colonel. There are 12 formal grievances from junior enlisted personnel. 8 of them were withdrawn within 2 weeks of filing. Mitchell took his glasses off and set them on the desk with a soft click. He looked at her with the expression of a man absorbing a fact that he should have discovered himself, a failure of oversight that was now staring him in the face. Withdrawn, he repeated, the word sounding hollow. Withdrawn, she confirmed, which means one of 2 things. Either the problem resolved itself 14 times in 14 months, or the people who filed those complaints found reasons to believe that the cost of pursuing them was higher than the cost of suffering in silence. The sentence hung in the air between them, heavy and undeniable. Mitchell picked his glasses back up, cleaned them with a slow, deliberate motion, and put them back on. He cleared his throat and looked back at the screen, but his eyes were distant. In that quiet moment, Ava could see the weight of institutional responsibility settling onto his shoulders. It wasn't the abstract weight of his rank or the prestige of his position. It was the specific, agonizing weight of having missed something real, something that had been happening in a building with his name at the top of the organizational chart. He hadn't missed it through malice or neglect, but through a systemic blindness that accumulates when a culture is allowed to go unexamined for too long. Kaine, Mitchell finally said, the name a question. Kaine is the most visible symptom, Ava said, but he's not the only one. Mitchell nodded slowly, his mind moving through his roster. Pierce. Pierce is more complicated, Ava said, pausing to choose her words with the care of someone defusing a bomb. Kaine operates from a position of overt authority. He's the hammer. Pierce, however, operates from a position of strategic alignment. She calculates who holds the power in any given room and adjusts her behavior to match. That's a different problem, and in many ways, it's a harder one to fix because it's adaptive. It's evolutionary. She's been protected by her performance record, Mitchell noted. People with her profile usually are, Ava countered. She closed the laptop slightly, the glow on their faces dimming. The assessment isn't asking you to make final decisions tonight, Colonel. It's asking you to have accurate information. What you do with that information is your responsibility. Mitchell looked at her over the rim of his glasses. It wasn't a challenge. It was a genuine request for insight. He was a man trying to learn something, not avoid it. What would you do with it? Ava thought about it. She didn't give a canned response or a textbook answer. She gave him the truth. I'd start with the complaints, she said. The ones that were withdrawn. I'd find those soldiers and I'd have a conversation with each of them. Not a formal interview, not a recorded session with a stenographer, just a conversation. And I'd make absolutely certain they understood that the withdrawal of a complaint is not the same thing as the problem disappearing. Mitchell was quiet for a long moment, the implications of that action radiating through his mind. That's going to be uncomfortable, he said. Yes, Ava agreed. It is. She did not offer to make it easier for him. She didn't soften the blow or provide a way out. She let the discomfort sit there in the room, raw and necessary, because the comfort of leadership is rarely compatible with the integrity of leadership. And Mitchell was smart enough to know that already. He just needed someone to say it plainly. The next morning arrived at Fort Liberty the way mornings always arrive after a night of reckoning, earlier than expected and sharper than was comfortable. It carried the distinct quality of a day that was going to demand things from people before they were fully ready to give them. Marcus Kaine was awake long before the réveil. He hadn't slept, at least not in any way that counted as rest. He had lain in his bunk in that particular state of hyper-wakefulness where the mind refuses to stop running, looping through the same sequence of events backward and forward. He had spent the night examining every moment from the previous evening, looking for a different angle, a different choice, a different outcome. He found several. He found them repeatedly. He found them with the exhaustive, punishing thoroughness of a man who cannot turn off the light in his own head. At 5:47 a.m., Marcus was sitting in the small, cramped office attached to his unit's training bay. A cup of coffee sat on the edge of the desk, long since gone cold and forming a thin film on the surface. He was staring at a blank legal pad, the yellow paper bright and accusing under the fluorescent lights. He had intended to write something, an account, a statement, his own version of the events before the official narrative took over and rendered his voice irrelevant. That was his instinct, the defensive, controlling instinct that had governed most of his adult life. Protect the position. Control the narrative. Get there first. He picked up his pen and held it over the paper, his hand hovering, but the words wouldn't come. He kept thinking about what Ava had said in the mess hall. It wasn't her credentials or her rank that haunted him. It was the question. If you didn't know who I was, why didn't I deserve basic respect? He put the pen down. He picked up the cold coffee, took a swallow that tasted like copper and old beans, and set it back down. He didn't know about the 12 formal grievances yet. He wouldn't know about those until much later, when the review process officially began. But he knew about other things. He knew about the smaller, quieter moments that had never made it into a report because he had been so good at keeping them small. He remembered the private he had dressed down in front of the entire unit over a minor equipment mistake that could have been handled with a quiet word. He remembered the junior sergeant he had publicly corrected in a briefing, mocking the man's terminology even though it was technically accurate, just to assert his own dominance. He thought about the half-dozen moments over the last 2 years where he had chosen the path that reinforced his authority over the path that preserved someone else's dignity. He had never seen those moments as a pattern before. He had seen them as standards. He had seen them as tough leadership. But as he sat in the gray light of the early morning, he saw them for what they were, a series of small, calculated cruelties. The door to the office creaked open. Davis stood in the doorway, still in his PT gear, his hair damp from a quick session. He had the look of a man who had also spent the night tossing and turning, but was now trying to act as though the previous evening was something they could simply navigate around rather than walk through. "Hey," Davis said, his voice hesitant. "Hey," Marcus replied. Davis came in and took the chair across from the desk. He looked at the blank pad, the cold coffee, and the pen lying at an angle like an abandoned tool. He wasn't a complicated man. He didn't look for subtext or hidden meanings. He processed things in a straight line. He had laughed last night because Marcus had laughed, and because laughing with Marcus was always the path of least resistance. He had felt the discomfort eventually, but he hadn't felt it soon enough to do anything about it. And he knew it. He was in this office at 5:50 a.m. because something inside him needed to account for that failure, even if he didn't know how to put it into words. "I should have said something," Davis finally said, "last night, before it got to where it got." Marcus looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time in years, he didn't try to manage the interaction. "Yeah," Marcus said, "you should have." Davis blinked, absorbing the hit. He had expected Marcus to either offer him absolution or dismiss the whole thing as a joke. The plain, unvarnished agreement was much harder to receive. "What happens now?" Davis asked. "I don't know," Marcus said. "Something official. A review. Probably a lot of conversations with people who outrank me." He paused, his gaze drifting back to the blank paper. "Probably some conversations I really don't want to have." Davis nodded slowly. "You going to be okay?" Marcus was quiet for a long, heavy moment. "I don't know that either," he said. The honesty of it, unperformed, unmanaged, just the plain truth spoken in the quiet of the morning, felt stranger and more significant than anything that had happened the night before. It was the sound of a man finally admitting he was lost. Across the base, in the temporary quarters assigned to her, Ava Morgan had been awake for 2 hours. She wasn't reviewing files or preparing reports. She was sitting on the edge of her bunk, the room bathed in the soft, pre-dawn light, holding a photograph. The photo was old, the edges softened by years of handling. It showed 2 people in civilian clothes on a beach somewhere, a woman in her late 40s and a younger version of Ava, maybe 17 or 18. Both were laughing at something just out of frame. The older woman had the same sharp bone structure as Ava, the same quality of stillness in her face even in the middle of a laugh. Ava stared at the image for a long time. People often assumed that her ability to walk into a hostile room and remain completely unaffected was a natural trait, that she was simply built without the standard human reflexes of fear or hesitation. They thought her calm was constitutional. They were wrong. The calm was a construction. It was something she had built, brick by brick, over years of experiences that had required her to systematically dismantle her own self-protection reflexes and replace them with something more durable. It wasn't the absence of feeling. It was the ability to feel everything while choosing an action that was independent of those feelings. She had learned that from her mother. Her mother had been a military nurse who had worked in conditions that would have broken most people, witnessing the absolute limits of human endurance and cruelty. When Ava was 16, she had been badly humiliated by a group of girls at school, coming home shaking with the violent, transformative shame that only an adolescent can feel. Her mother hadn't hugged her or told her it didn't matter. She had looked her in the eye and said something Ava had carried with her into every room since. You don't get to choose whether people underestimate you. You only get to choose what you do while they're doing it. Ava put the photograph away. She stood up, smoothed the covers of her bunk, and prepared for the day. She had work to do. At 0800 hours, Colonel Mitchell called a formal assembly in the installation's main briefing room. This wasn't the mess hall with its lingering sense of food and casual atmosphere. The briefing room was a place of hard surfaces and clinical lighting, designed for the transmission of orders and the analysis of data. It held about 60 people, and as the senior NCOs and officers filed in, the air felt thick with a different kind of tension. There was no Friday evening looseness here, no crowd energy. Just rows of men and women in uniform, sitting with the particular stillness of people who know that something consequential is about to happen. Marcus Kaine sat in the third row, his eyes fixed forward. Rachel Pierce was in the fourth, her expression a mask of professional neutrality. Ethan Brooks wasn't in the room. He wasn't senior enough to be summoned. But the news of the assembly was already rippling through the lower ranks. Mitchell stood at the front of the room. Ava was to his left, and two other personnel from the assessment program, civilians in sharp suits carrying secure tablets, stood to his right. Mitchell didn't waste time. He spoke for 12 minutes. He didn't minimize what had happened the night before, and he didn't try to contextualize it in a way that softened the blow. He stated plainly that the events had revealed serious, deep-seated deficiencies in the leadership culture of the installation. He said those deficiencies were now documented, that they would be addressed, and that the process would be uncomfortable and mandatory. He used the word mandatory twice, and nobody in the room mistook his meaning. Then he said something that caught everyone off guard. "I want to be clear about something," Mitchell said, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "This review is not a punishment program. It is a correction program. There is a profound difference, and I intend to honor that difference." He looked around the room, making eye contact with the people in the front rows. Every person in this room has the capacity to be a better leader than they were yesterday. That is not a soft statement. It is a factual one, and I am going to hold each of you to it, including myself. The phrase, including myself, moved through the room like a physical wave. Mitchell was not a man given to public self-examination. He was a colonel with a record that commanded respect and a posture that discouraged questioning. Hearing him include himself in the accounting without caveat or excuse shifted the atmosphere in a way that a formal order never could. Marcus looked at the back of the chair in front of him. Rachel Pierce looked down at her hands. Master Sergeant Holloway, a veteran of 20 years who sat in the front row, exhaled slowly through his nose. Then Ava stepped forward. She held a tablet but didn't open it. She looked at the room with that same unsettling, direct gaze. "I want to address something directly," she said, "because I think it's the question sitting underneath everything else in this room. Some of you are wondering if last night was a trap. You're wondering if this entire assessment was constructed to catch you in a mistake and use it against you." She paused, letting the thought hang there. It wasn't. The purpose of last night, and every night like it across the 12 installations this program has evaluated, is not to catalog individual failures. It is to understand the conditions that produce them. You cannot fix a culture by addressing individuals in isolation. You have to address the conditions, and to address the conditions, you have to be willing to see them clearly. A captain in the second row, a man named Okafor, raised his hand slightly. Ava nodded to him. "What happens to the people who were directly involved?" Okafor asked. He wasn't being aggressive, he was being careful. He was trying to understand the new rules of the world he now found himself in. "That is a command decision," Ava said. "Not an assessment decision. The assessment documents the reality of what happened. The command structure determines the consequences and the corrective action. That is exactly how the system is designed to work." She took a breath. "What I can tell you is that the assessment does not recommend punitive action as a primary response. It recommends corrective development. A soldier who understands what they did wrong and changes their behavior is worth infinitely more to this institution than a soldier who is punished and learns nothing." Marcus felt a strange shifting in his chest. Not relief, but something more complex. It was the sensation of being given something he didn't feel he deserved, and the crushing weight of trying to figure out how to respond to that grace. The assembly ended, and the room emptied with a subdued energy. People filed out in silence, their minds heavy with things to process. When the doors finally closed, only Mitchell, Ava, Marcus, Rachel, and the two civilian observers remained. Mitchell sat down at the head of the briefing table. "Sergeant Kaine," he said, "I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to answer it honestly, not strategically, not for the record, honestly." He waited until Marcus met his eyes. "Do you understand what you did last night?" Marcus was still standing. He considered sitting, then decided against it. He wanted to feel the floor beneath his boots. "I humiliated someone I had no right to humiliate," he said, his voice steady but low. "I used the fact that she appeared vulnerable to make myself look strong in front of people I wanted to impress. And when she started demonstrating that I was wrong, I escalated instead of stopping. I escalated because stopping felt like losing." He took a breath, the words coming harder now. "And the reason stopping felt like losing is because I've been treating leadership like a competition for so long that I stopped being able to tell the difference between competing and leading." The room was silent. Mitchell looked at him for a long time, searching for any sign of performance, any hint of a lie. Finding none, he nodded. "Sit down, Sergeant." Marcus sat. Mitchell turned his gaze to Rachel. Rachel Pierce had spent the last 14 hours preparing for this. She was intelligent, disciplined, and she had rehearsed several versions of this conversation in her head. She had a version that was a measured acknowledgement, a version that was a professional accounting, and a version that carefully contextualized her choices. But looking at Mitchell and then at Ava, whose patient attention seemed to strip away every layer of artifice, Rachel found that her rehearsed words felt like ash in her mouth. "I made choices last night that I'm not proud of," she said. "It wasn't the polished version. It was raw and uncomfortable." "Tell me about those choices," Mitchell prompted. Rachel looked at her hands for a moment, then looked up. "I encouraged it. When Sergeant Kaine started the confrontation, I could have stopped it. I could have said nothing. Instead, I suggested a specific line of attack. I did it because..." She cleared her throat, forcing the words out. "Because watching someone else be diminished in that room felt safer than being the one who was diminished. And I've been making that calculation in one way or another since the day I arrived at this installation." She paused, the weight of the admission hanging over her. "That's the honest answer." Ava hadn't moved, but the quality of her stillness changed. It became denser, more focused. She looked at Rachel with a level of attention that was different from the way she had looked at anyone else that day. "Lieutenant Pierce," Ava said quietly, "I want to ask you something directly. That calculation you just described, weighing the cost of speaking up against the cost of staying quiet and aligning with power, how often do you make it?" Rachel didn't look away. "More often than I should," she said. "How often is that?" "Almost every day," Rachel admitted. The honesty of it landed in the room like a physical weight. It wasn't just Rachel's truth. Everyone in that room recognized it. The calculation she was describing wasn't an anomaly. It was the daily mathematics of survival in a hierarchical system. Most people performed it automatically, never stopping to consider what they were optimizing for or what they were trading away in the process. Ava let the silence sit, allowing the truth of the statement to breathe. Then she said something no one expected. "Me too," she said softly. Marcus looked up. Rachel's eyes widened. Even the civilian observers at the side of the room shifted in their seats. "The calculation doesn't go away because you outrank it," Ava continued. "It just changes form. It becomes more sophisticated, more buried, but the underlying pressure is the same. The pressure to align with whatever holds power in the moment. The pressure to believe that speaking up costs more than staying quiet." She leaned forward slightly. "The difference isn't that some people don't feel that pressure. The difference is what they decide to do when they feel it." Rachel looked at Ava for a long time. It was a look of complex recognition, a mixing of resistance, realization, and the profound discomfort of seeing oneself reflected in an unexpected source. It was the beginning of something new, something that wasn't yet resolved but was undeniably real. Mitchell closed his folder, the sound sharp in the quiet room. "Here is what happens next," he said, looking at both Marcus and Rachel. "Both of you are being placed into a formal leadership development program effective Monday morning. This is not a demotion. It is not a termination. It is an investment in you in this installation and in the soldiers who serve under you." He paused, letting the words sink in. "You will not enjoy all of it. That is by design. If you engage with it honestly, it will change the way you lead. I am asking you to engage with it honestly." Marcus nodded once, a sharp, heavy motion of acceptance. Rachel followed suit, her expression tight but resolute. Mitchell looked at Ava. "Is there anything else the assessment requires from this meeting?" Ava looked at her team, then back at the colonel. "One thing," she said. "The soldiers who filed grievances in the past 14 months. I want your commitment on the record that each of them will be contacted personally. By you, Colonel, not by your staff, by you." Mitchell held her gaze for a long beat. "You have it," he said. The meeting ended. Marcus and Rachel left through the same door, but they didn't speak. They moved apart as soon as they hit the hallway, two people starting separate journeys toward the same uncertain destination. Inside the room, the observers began packing their equipment, their faces returning to their detached, professional masks. Mitchell walked to the window and stood with his hands clasped behind his back. He looked out at the base, at the motor pools, the training grounds, and the hundreds of soldiers moving between them, each carrying their own burdens, their own fears, and their own silent calculations. Ava stood beside him for a moment. "You did the right thing this morning," she said. "I should have done it 14 months ago," Mitchell replied, his voice heavy with regret. "Yes," Ava said, refusing to offer him the easy out of a polite lie. "You should have." Mitchell turned to her. "Will the program recommend further action against the installation?" "The program recommends what the evidence supports," Ava said. "And right now the evidence supports the conclusion that this installation has a correctable culture problem, and a commanding officer who is finally willing to fix it." She paused, looking out at the morning sun hitting the parade ground. "That matters more than you might think." She turned and walked out of the office, her footsteps even and steady, leaving the colonel alone with the silence of his command and the work that was only just beginning. The quietest corners of a military installation are rarely truly silent. There is always the distant hum of a generator, the rhythmic vibration of a heavy truck idling on the far side of the motor pool, or the muffled cadence of a training platoon echoing off the corrugated metal of the warehouses. But inside the small, cramped supply room at the edge of the logistics bay, Ethan Brooks found a version of silence that felt heavy and expectant. It was a room filled with the scent of canvas, gun oil, and old paper, a place where he could disappear for an hour when the weight of the base became too much to carry. He sat on a crate of folded olive-drab blankets, a legal pad balanced on his knee, trying to write a letter home to his grandmother in rural Tennessee. His grandmother was 73 years old, a woman who had spent her entire life in a house that sat at the end of a long, gravel driveway, surrounded by the kind of stillness that only the deep woods can provide. She had raised him after his parents had fractured and drifted away when he was 9. She was a woman of plain language and even plainer truths, the kind of person who looked at a person's hands and their eyes rather than the ribbons on their chest or the titles after their name. In her world, respect was something you earned every morning and could lose by sunset if you weren't careful. As Ethan sat in the dim light of the supply room, he found himself struggling to translate the events of the past week into words she would understand, not because she lacked the intelligence, but because the events themselves felt like they belonged to a different, more fractured world. He tried to tell her about the woman who had walked into the mess hall, Ava Morgan. He tried to describe the oversized jacket she wore, the way she seemed to take up no space at all until the moment she took up everything. He wrote about the cruelty of the men at the table, the way the air had curdled with their arrogance, and the specific, hollow sound of Marcus Kaine's laughter. He wrote about his own attempt to speak up, a gesture that had felt both necessary and woefully insufficient. But as he looked at the ink on the page, he realized he wasn't capturing the residue of the evening. He wasn't capturing the way the atmosphere of the base had changed, the way a single question had acted like a chemical catalyst, turning something solid into something liquid and unstable. He crumpled the first draft and tossed it into a corner. The second draft followed shortly after, discarded because it sounded too much like a report and not enough like a confession. The third version was too emotional, lacking the stoicism he had learned to cultivate in the army. He took a deep breath, the cold air of the supply room stinging his lungs, and started a fourth version. "Dear Grandma," he wrote, "something happened last night that I keep thinking about. A woman came into the mess hall and people were awful to her. She let them be awful because she knew something they didn't. And when the truth came out, it wasn't the truth that mattered most. It was the question she asked afterward. She asked, if you didn't know who I was, why didn't I deserve basic respect?" He paused, his pen hovering over the yellow paper. "Nobody could answer it," he continued, "including me, even though I was the one who tried to say something. I thought about you when she asked it. I thought about how you always said that how you treat people when there's nothing in it for you is the only true measure of character. I didn't think that was true when I was 12. I thought character was about being brave or being strong, but I think I understand it now. He looked at the words, feeling the weight of them. He folded the paper carefully, his fingers tracing the creases, and tucked it into an envelope. He wrote her address with a steady hand, realizing with a sudden, quiet clarity that the evening in the mess hall hadn't ended when Ava Morgan walked out the door. It had only just begun its real work, moving through the base like a slow-moving front, settling into the cracks of people's lives where they thought they were safe from scrutiny. The letter reached his grandmother on a Tuesday. The rural mail carrier had left it in the box at the end of the gravel drive, and she had walked down to get it in the cool mountain air, her sweater pulled tight against her chest. She read it at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside her. 3 states away on that same morning, Marcus Kaine's coffee was also going cold on his desk. A coincidence that meant absolutely nothing and yet felt like the universe aligning in a moment of shared stillness. She read Ethan's letter once, then twice, her eyes moving slowly over his handwriting. She sat with it for a long time, the way people who have lived through many winters know how to sit with a heavy thought before they try to move it. 4 days later, she wrote back. Her letter was brief, typed on an old manual typewriter that sat in the corner of her living room. You already knew the answer to her question before she asked it, she wrote. That's why you spoke up. Don't let anyone convince you that knowing the right thing and doing the right thing are 2 separate skills. They are the same muscle, Ethan. If you don't use it, it withers. Ethan read that letter standing at the mail station on base, the sounds of shouting NCOs and marching boots swirling around him. He folded it and tucked it into his breast pocket, right against his chest, a small piece of paper that felt heavier than his body armor. He didn't know then that the letter would still be in that pocket 6 months later when the world they knew would change again. But that was for later. First, there were the weeks of waiting. The weeks following the assessment at Fort Liberty moved with a different rhythm than the ones that had come before. On the surface, the institutional machinery of the military continued its indifferent grind. Training schedules were posted, formations were held at the same pre-dawn hours, and the logistics of a massive installation hummed along as they always had. But underneath that surface routine, the atmosphere had shifted. It was a subtle change, the way the air feels before a thunderstorm breaks, a heaviness in the chest, a certain electric charge that makes the hair on your arms stand up. The leadership development program that Colonel Mitchell had ordered began the following Monday, and the first session was held in a nondescript conference room in the basement of the headquarters building. Marcus Kaine arrived 7 minutes early. He had considered not going, though he knew it wasn't a real option. In the military, a recommendation from a colonel was a direct order in all but name, especially when your career was already hovering on the edge of a precipice. He had thought about the exit strategy, the way a driver looks at an off-ramp on a long highway, but he had driven past it. He walked into the room and found 2 people waiting for him. One was a civilian psychologist named Dr. Sandra Asai, a woman in her mid-40s with a presence that felt like a calm, deep pool of water. The other was a retired command sergeant major named Briggs. Briggs was 61 years old, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of a piece of old oak and then left out in the rain for 20 years. He was a man who had seen the worst of humanity in various corners of the globe and had reached a point in his life where he no longer felt the need to raise his voice to be heard. Marcus sat across from them, a blank legal pad in front of him. He felt exposed, stripped of the rank and the swagger that usually served as his armor. Briggs looked at him for a long time, his eyes steady and unblinking. There was no judgment in the gaze, only a clinical, weary sort of observation. Tell me about the first time you humiliated someone with less power than you, Briggs said. His voice was unhurried, precise. Not last week in the mess hall, not the time before that. I want the first time you remember doing it. The question caught Marcus off guard. He had expected a lecture on leadership ethics or a PowerPoint presentation on interpersonal communication. He opened his mouth to give a standard, defensive answer, but the words died in his throat as he looked at Briggs. The old sergeant major had the look of a man who could see through a lie before it was even fully formed. Marcus looked down at his legal pad. He thought about a boy named Christopher. They were in the 4th grade. Christopher had shown up to school in shoes that were falling apart, the soles flapping against the pavement like a broken heart. Marcus had waited until after school in the parking lot where 8 other 9-year-olds were gathered, and he had made a joke. It was a sharp joke, a clever one, the kind that made the other kids roar with laughter. "I was 9, Marcus said, his voice sounding thin in the quiet room. "I said something about a kid's shoes. Christopher. He was poor and I wanted everyone to know I wasn't. Briggs didn't move. What happened? He cried," Marcus said. "He just stood there and cried while I felt good." The word came out flat and honest, and it cost Marcus something to say it. I felt good because everyone was laughing at my words. I was the center of it. I've been chasing that feeling my entire adult life. I just got better at building more sophisticated ways to produce it. Briggs didn't write anything down. He just nodded slowly, checking a mental box. Not the box of a confession, but the box of actual recognition. "Most people never clear that bar," Briggs said simply. "You'd be surprised how many men grow old and die without ever admitting they like the taste of someone else's shame. That's the beginning, Kaine. We can't fix the house until we find the rot in the foundation." 3 rooms away, in a session that ran parallel to Marcus's, Rachel Pierce was sitting across from Dr. Osai. If Marcus's problem was a blunt instrument, Rachel's was a scalpel. She operated from the inside out, her calculations internal and precise. She was an intelligent woman, and she knew that intelligence without integrity didn't lead to better choices. It just led to more complex justifications for bad ones. She had spent a decade perfecting the art of alignment, staying close to power, moving with the current, and ensuring she was never the one caught in the crosshairs. "You said during the command meeting that you make the alignment calculation almost every day, Doctor," Osai said, leaning forward. Her voice was quiet, inviting. "I want to know what that feels like in your body, not in your head, Rachel, in your body." Rachel blinked. She was prepared for an analytical debate, a discussion of career paths and institutional dynamics. She wasn't prepared for a question about her physical sensations. "It feels like vertigo," Rachel admitted after a moment. "Like I'm standing at the edge of a high cliff. There's a split second of dizziness, and then I make the choice to stay quiet or to agree with the loudest person in the room, and the vertigo goes away. The safety returns." "Where did you learn that safety was more important than the truth?" Osai asked. Rachel remained very still. She thought back to her first week at officer candidate school. She remembered an instructor, a man whose name she had tried to scrub from her memory, who had targeted any female candidate who showed a glimmer of independent judgment. He didn't do anything illegal, nothing that could be documented or reported, but he made their lives a living hell in the small, grinding ways that break a person's spirit. She had watched the ones who pushed back. She had watched them wash out or become pariahs. And she had watched the ones who kept their heads down and their mouths shut. "I chose not to be a target," Rachel said quietly. "I told myself it was strategy. I told myself I would speak up later once I had the rank, once I was safe." She looked at the cup of tea Dr. Osai had offered her, which was now stone cold. "That was 11 years ago. The later I was waiting for kept moving. The horizon never got any closer. When I watched Sergeant Kaine in the mess hall, and I made that comment about the FM 322, 9 question, I wasn't trying to be helpful. I was making sure that as long as the woman in the jacket was the target, I wouldn't be." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and undeniable. Safe. Such a small word for such a total surrender of character. While Kaine and Pierce were navigating the wreckage of their own choices, the rest of Fort Liberty continued to breathe. Soldiers who had been in the mess hall that Friday evening carried the experience with them, a residue that hadn't yet been fully processed. You could see it in the way a sergeant spoke to a junior soldier in the motor pool. A slight hesitation, a dial turned just a fraction toward consideration. You could see it in the way a corporal named Yates, known for his caustic wit, started to make a sharp comment in the break room and then simply stopped. He didn't finish the sentence. He just looked uncomfortable and walked away. Ethan Brooks noticed these things. He had become a quiet observer of the base's soul, filing away these small ripples as they moved outward from the epicenter. He did his job, he marched in the formations, and he kept his head down. But he was waiting. He knew that a moment like the one Ava Morgan had created didn't just dissipate. It demanded a response that went beyond a few counseling sessions for 2 NCOs. On the 8th day after the assessment, that response arrived in the form of a knock on Colonel Mitchell's door. Private First Class Domings was 20 years old, a small, compact young man from Albuquerque who had learned early in his life that the best way to survive was to take up as little space as possible. He stood in the doorway of Mitchell's office, his cap clutched in his hands, his knuckles white. Mitchell looked up from his desk. He had been expecting someone to come through that door. The atmosphere of the base had left a vacuum, and someone was bound to fill it. "Private Domings," Mitchell said, gesturing to a chair. "Come in. Sit down." Domings sat on the edge of the chair, turning his cap over and over in his hands. It was the movement of someone whose mouth was trying to work up the courage to say something the rest of his body wanted to flee from. "Sir," he began, his voice wavering. "I filed a complaint 14 months ago about Sergeant Kaine." Mitchell nodded slowly. "I know. I've read the file. You withdrew it 3 days after you filed it. I'd like to know why." The silence in the office was absolute. Domings looked down at his boots. "Someone told me that Kaine had friends in the review office," he said. "They told me that complaints against him tended to find their way to the wrong people before they ever reached the right ones. They said that soldiers who didn't drop their grievances found themselves on the worst details, the worst rotations, for months afterward." He paused, his jaw working. "I couldn't afford that, sir. I send money home to my mother. I couldn't risk my pay or my position. I couldn't." Mitchell felt a cold weight settle in his gut. It was the weight of accountability. He was the commander. This was his house, his culture, and under his watch, a young soldier had been silenced by the very system designed to protect him. "Was what you were told accurate?" Mitchell asked, his voice low. "About the complaints being leaked?" "I don't know for sure, sir," Domings said. "But 3 other guys who filed around the same time all withdrew theirs within the same week. We didn't talk about it. We all got the same feeling, like the air had run out of the room." Mitchell sat back, staring at the young man across from him. He saw the caution in Domings's eyes, the way he was braced for a dismissal that hadn't come yet. "Who told you to drop it?" Mitchell asked. Domings shook his head. "I'd rather not say, sir. Not yet." Mitchell didn't push. He understood that trust was a fragile thing, easily broken and painstakingly rebuilt. "It's okay," he said. "You don't have to give me a name today. But I want you to know that the channel you're looking for, the one where you can speak without fear, is being rebuilt right now. I intend to make sure that what happened to you never happens to another soldier on this base." Domings looked at him, and for a fleeting second, the armor of his caution slipped. Something that wasn't quite hope but looked like the beginning of it moved across his face. "The original complaint, sir," he said. "What Sergeant Kaine did. It wasn't the worst thing that's ever happened to me. I want to be clear about that. But it was the first time in the Army that I felt like I didn't matter. Like my rank made me invisible, and that invisibility could be used as a weapon. That feeling is hard to carry while you're trying to do your job." "I know," Mitchell said, and he meant it. "I'm sorry it took this long for someone to listen." Domings stood up, squared his shoulders, and delivered a crisp salute. When he walked out of the office, Mitchell didn't return to his paperwork. He sat in the silence, thinking about the 14 months of silence that had preceded this moment. He thought about the 12 complaints he had seen in the archives, the 8 that had been withdrawn, and the pattern of intimidation that had flourished in the shadows of his own command. He realized that his own silence, his own focus on metrics and mission readiness, had provided the shade in which that rot could grow. He picked up his phone and made a call to the Inspector General's office. It was a call that would likely trigger a massive investigation into his own administrative staff. A call that could potentially end his career or at least stall his next promotion. He made it anyway. 3 days later, Ava Morgan was still at Fort Liberty. Her original orders had been for a 72-hour assessment, but she had requested an extension, citing the need for a longitudinal observation of cultural shifts. In truth, she stayed because she wanted to see if the seeds she had planted would actually take root in the rocky soil of the base. She was walking back to her temporary quarters after a late evening workout when she saw a figure waiting near her door. It was Private Ethan Brooks. He looked nervous, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He had spent the last hour debating whether to be there at all. It was a breach of protocol, a junior enlisted soldier seeking out a high-level civilian assessor without an appointment. But the question he was carrying had become too heavy to hold. "Private Brooks," Ava said as she approached. Her voice was neutral but not unkind. She had the same quality of total, focused attention that Ethan remembered from the mess hall. "Ma'am," Ethan said, coming to attention. "I apologize for the intrusion. I should have gone through the office. What did you want to ask?" she interrupted. Her eyes were fixed on his, and Ethan felt as though she could see the exact shape of the thoughts in his head. "How do you do it?" he blurted out. "How do you keep walking into rooms where nobody wants you?" where people have already decided you don't belong. How do you keep walking in day after day? Ava looked at him for a long moment. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, bruised shadows across the asphalt. She thought about her mother's voice, about the old photograph she kept in her wallet, the one with the soft edges and the laughter caught in time. She thought about the dozens of bases she had visited, the hundreds of rooms filled with men who looked at her and saw only a problem to be managed. You don't get to choose whether people underestimate you, she said. That is a reflection of their limitations, not yours. You only get to choose what you do while they're doing it. Ethan absorbed that. The simplicity of it was startling. That's it, he asked. That's the whole thing, she said. Everything else, the protocols, the rank, the procedures, that's just the noise. The core of it is deciding that your value isn't subject to a majority vote. Does it get easier? Ethan asked. Ava thought about the question honestly. The rooms get different, she said. You get better at reading them faster. You learn how to spot the cracks in the armor before the person even speaks. You learn not to waste your breath on the people who are committed to their own blindness. But more importantly, you get better at finding the Ethan Brooks in every room. He blinked, surprised. The what? The person who knows it's wrong, she said. Every room has one. Sometimes they're young like you, sometimes they're old and tired, but there is always someone present who knows that the respect being denied to another person is a debt they are all accruing. Finding that person, making sure they know they aren't alone. That's more than half the work, Private. They stood in the gathering dusk, the air cooling rapidly. Ethan felt a sense of relief, a loosening of the tension that had been coiled in his chest since the night in the mess hall. They've started the program, he said, Sergeant Kaine and Lieutenant Pierce. I saw them going into the basement. Do you think it will work? Ava leaned against the doorframe of her quarters. Kaine is doing the harder work, she said. He's going backward looking for the source of the rot. It's a painful process, and most people quit before they finish it. But if he sticks with it, the change will be real. Pierce, she's working from the outside in. She understands the mechanics of her behavior, but she hasn't found the root yet. Self-awareness in a person who hasn't yet decided to be honest is a dangerous thing. But she has the capacity. Whether she uses it is her choice. And what about Domings? Ethan asked. The news of the private coming forward had traveled through the barracks like wildfire. Ava's expression softened, a brief flash of something that looked like pride. Domings coming forward was the most important thing that happened on this base in the last 10 days, she said. More important than what I did in the mess hall. More important than the colonel's assembly. Moments create headlines, Brooks. Precedents create cultures. Domings created a precedent. Ethan nodded, thinking about the weight of that. And the colonel calling the IG, he asked. Ava looked at him with a faint, knowing smile. You really do pay attention, don't you? You told me to, Ethan reminded her. You said the strongest thing in the room isn't always the loudest. I've been trying to listen for the quiet things. Mitchell calling the IG is a commander choosing accountability over his own comfort, Ava said. That call wasn't free. It will cost him. But he realized that the cost of his silence had become higher than the cost of his speech. That is what leadership looks like when the cameras are off and the ribbons don't matter. She stepped toward her door. Go get some rest, Private. You have a long road ahead of you. Ethan watched her go, the door clicking shut behind her. He walked back toward the barracks, the sound of his own boots on the gravel rhythmic and steady. He thought about the letter in his pocket, the grandmother in Tennessee, and the boy named Christopher who had cried in a parking lot 20 years ago. He realized that the world was a collection of these small, interconnected threads, the choices made in supply rooms, the grievances filed in quiet offices, and the questions asked in crowded mess halls. None of them were isolated. They were all part of a single, continuous story about what it meant to be a person of character in a world that often rewarded the opposite. The base felt different that night. The heavy trucks were still idling, the generators were still humming, and the distant call of a bugle echoed across the parade ground. But as Ethan Brooks looked up at the stars, he felt a sense of clarity he had never known. The weather had shifted. The storm hadn't passed. In many ways, it was just beginning. But for the first time, he felt like he knew exactly where he stood. He was no longer just a witness to the events at Fort Liberty. He was a participant in the slow, difficult work of turning a moment into a movement. And as he reached the barracks, he knew that the next time he sat down to write a letter home, he wouldn't have to struggle for the words. He would simply tell his grandmother that he was learning how to use the muscle she had told him about, and that for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of the weight it would have to carry. As the weeks turned into months, The ripples of that evening continued to expand. The investigation triggered by Colonel Mitchell's call to the IG uncovered a network of small-scale corruption and intimidation that had existed for years, hidden in the bureaucratic shadows of the administration. People were reassigned, some were disciplined, and others quietly retired. The leadership program led by Briggs and Dr. Osai became a permanent fixture of the base, though it was never easy and rarely popular. Marcus Kaine stayed in the program long after his mandatory sessions were over, eventually becoming a mentor for younger NCOs who struggled with the same demons he had faced. Rachel Pierce eventually transferred to a different command, but those who worked with her afterward noted a change, a stillness, a refusal to play the games of alignment that had once been her trademark. And in a small house at the end of a gravel road in Tennessee, an old woman sat on her porch, reading a new letter from her grandson. She smiled as she read his description of a morning run, the way the fog lifted off the fields, and the way his boots felt solid on the earth. She knew, as only those who have lived long enough can know, that her grandson had found something that many people spend their entire lives searching for. He had found his own voice, and he had found the courage to use it even when the room was silent. She set the letter down and looked out at the woods, satisfied that the seeds she had planted so many years ago had finally, irrevocably taken hold. The sun was beginning its slow, weighted descent over Fort Liberty, casting long, amber-hued shadows across the asphalt and the parched grass of the training grounds. Ethan Brooks stood in the cooling air, feeling the familiar grit of the base in his lungs, but everything felt different. The atmosphere had shifted. It wasn't just the quiet that follows a storm, but the heavy, expectant silence of a place that is finally beginning to hold its breath. He looked at Ava Morgan, who stood outside her temporary quarters, dressed in simple PT clothes that did nothing to hide the particular, unmistakable quality of her presence. She wasn't just standing there. She was occupying the space with a stillness that Ethan had only ever seen in people who had nothing left to fear, because they had already faced the worst versions of themselves. Ava had been talking about the Inspector General's investigation, a process that was now grinding into gear like a massive, rusted machine, finally finding its rhythm. She had told him that the findings would be systemic, that they would find problems woven into the very fabric of the command structure. She knew, and more importantly, Marcus Kaine knew, that these findings would reflect directly on his leadership. It was a career-ending trajectory, a slow-motion collision with the consequences of a decade of choices. Yet, as Ava pointed out with a quiet, piercing clarity, Kaine had made the call anyway. He had initiated the very process that would likely dismantle his own legacy. She paused then, letting the weight of that fact settle between them. He made the call anyway, she had said, her voice steady against the distant hum of the bass. That matters. Ethan nodded slowly, his mind drifting to the small, folded piece of paper tucked into his breast pocket. It was a letter from his grandmother, a woman who had spent 80 years in a small town in Tennessee learning the difference between what people said and what they did. The letter contained only 3 sentences, written in a hand that was beginning to shake but had lost none of its conviction. "You already knew the answer before she asked it," she had written. "Don't let anyone convince you that knowing the right thing and doing the right thing are 2 separate skills." Ethan had been turning those words over in his head for 10 days, feeling the edges of them sharpen with every passing hour. He was beginning to think they were the only sentences he was going to need for a very long time, a compass for a world that seemed determined to break its own needle. He cleared his throat, the sound loud in the evening quiet. There was one more thing he needed to ask, something that had been nagging at the corners of his mind since the first night in the mess hall. "One more question," he said. Ava looked at him, her expression neutral but attentive. "Go ahead." "The dragon mark," Ethan began, his voice trailing off slightly as he searched for the right way to frame it. "The tattoo. I looked it up, or I tried to. I found what I could, which wasn't much, but some of the veterans online talk about it like it's..." He struggled for a word that didn't sound ridiculous in the presence of a woman who seemed so grounded in reality. Like it's almost mythological. Like the people who carry it are a different category of soldier entirely. Ava waited, her gaze never wavering. The low sun caught the edge of her profile, highlighting the scars and the lines of a life lived in the shadows of history. "Is that true?" Ethan asked, his voice dropping an octave. "Are you a different category?" She looked at him for a long moment, and for a second, Ethan thought she might not answer at all. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant sound of a rhythmic cadence from a marching unit blocks away. "No," she said finally. Her voice was simple, devoid of the mystique the internet forums tried to drape over her. Simply put, I'm a person who has had more practice than most at doing the thing that costs something, at speaking up when it's easier to stay quiet, at walking into the room when everything in your body says don't. She paused, looking out toward the horizon where the sky was turning a bruised purple. "The tattoo marks the missions, Ethan. It doesn't make the person. The person makes the person." She turned her gaze back to him, and he felt the full weight of her attention, same as it does for everyone. There was no magic in it, no secret serum or classified conditioning that could replace the fundamental architecture of a human soul. There was only the choice, made over and over again, in the dark and in the light, until it became a reflex. Ethan looked at her, and in that moment he saw through the legend. He thought about the mess hall on that Friday evening, a night that felt like it belonged to a different century. He pictured the woman in the oversized jacket who had stood completely still, while an officer threw her paperwork on the floor like it was trash. He remembered how she had answered every question with the ease of someone who had nothing to prove to a room full of people who were desperate to prove everything. And he thought about the moment when 200 soldiers, their phones raised like digital witnesses, had waited for a dramatic gesture or a devastating comeback. Instead, she had offered a single, quiet question that had dismantled the entire room. "If you didn't know who I was, why didn't I deserve basic respect?" He thought he finally understood why she had asked it that way. It wasn't to shame them. It wasn't to win a tactical engagement or to assert her dominance. It was to give them something they would have to carry. It was a seed planted in the middle of a toxic field, something that would arrive in quiet moments, weeks, months, or years later, in the middle of a situation that had nothing to do with Fort Liberty. It was designed to make them pause before they made the calculation, to make them feel the question before they answered it. He looked at Ava Morgan now, standing in her PT clothes with a particular quality of stillness. It wasn't the distance of a superior officer or the coldness of a professional killer. It was the presence of a person who was entirely where she was. She was committed to the moment she was standing in, without performance, without management, without the constant, low-level calculation of how she was being perceived by the world around her. Ethan thought to himself, this is what it looks like. This is what it actually looks like. Not the tattoo, not the classified designation, not the missions that existed in files he would never have the clearance to read. It was a person standing in the truth of who they were in an ordinary moment, with nothing to prove to anyone. He straightened his posture, not out of military protocol, but out of a sudden, deep-seated respect that went beyond rank. "Thank you, ma'am," he said. She nodded once, a sharp, economical movement. He turned to leave, his boots crunching on the gravel when her voice stopped him, Private Brooks. He turned back. She was looking at him with an expression that was the nearest thing she had to a smile. "Your grandmother sounds like someone worth listening to," she said. Ethan stared at her, his heart skipping a beat. She had not seen the letter. She couldn't have seen it. It had never left his pocket or his locker. Yet she held his gaze with an expression that suggested she understood the look of shock on his face and had absolutely no interest in explaining how she knew. It was as if she could read the frequency of his thoughts, or perhaps she simply recognized the caliber of the person he was becoming. He walked away across the base toward the barracks, the sky darkening behind him. Somewhere in the quiet of a small office with a single desk lamp, Marcus Kaine sat across from a retired command sergeant major with a face that had seen everything. Kaine picked up a pen and, for the first time in 25 years, wrote a name on a blank legal pad. Christopher. He stared at the name for a long time, the ink wet and dark under the lamp, and then he began to write. 6 weeks after that Friday evening, a night that nobody at Fort Liberty would ever fully stop thinking about, the seasons had begun to turn. The air was crisper, the heat of the Carolina summer finally yielding to the sharp, honest bite of autumn. Marcus Kaine walked into a leadership development session, a room where he had once commanded absolute, fearful silence, and put a letter on the table in front of Colonel Briggs. It wasn't a legal pad or a memo. It was an actual letter in a sealed envelope with Kaine's own handwriting on the front. Briggs looked at the envelope, then up at Marcus. His face was unreadable, the lines of his experience etched deep into his skin. "What's this?" he asked. "It's a letter to a kid named Christopher," Marcus said, his voice level but carrying a new, grounded weight. "He's 40 years old now. I have no idea where he lives or whether he'd even remember me, but I wrote it anyway because you told me to trace the problem to its source. I traced it, and that's where it started." He sat down, the chair creaking under him. "I'm not going to send it. I just needed to write it." Briggs picked up the envelope, turning it over in his hands. The paper was heavy, the seal firm. He set it back down and cleared his throat. "Why aren't you going to send it?" Marcus looked at him steadily, his eyes reflecting a man who had spent the last month staring into a mirror he didn't like. "Because an apology that arrives 25 years late for something a 9-year-old did to another 9-year-old is not really for the person receiving it," Marcus said. "It's for the person sending it. It's an attempt to feel better about yourself. And I'm trying to be honest about who this process is for. I don't want to use him to fix my own conscience." Briggs was quiet for a long moment, the hum of the air conditioning the only sound in the room. Then he said something Marcus hadn't expected. "Send it anyway." Marcus frowned, leaning forward. "I just said, I heard what you said," Briggs interrupted, "and you're right. It is for you. But it's also possibly for him." He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "The arrogance of deciding that someone else doesn't need to hear something because you've concluded it won't help them enough to be worth the discomfort of you sending it. That's the same muscle you've been exercising your whole life, Kaine. You're still trying to control the outcome. You're still trying to manage the situation so it fits your narrative of what's right." Briggs paused, letting the critique land. "Send the letter. Find him. Let him decide what it's worth. Don't take that choice away from him just to protect your own sense of integrity." Marcus sat with that, the words echoing in the empty spaces of his ego. The room was very quiet. He picked up the envelope, looking at the name he had written. "I don't even know how to find him," he admitted, his voice low. "Figure it out," Briggs said. "That's what you're good at, isn't it?" It took Marcus 11 days of searching through digital archives, old-school records, and the sprawling, tangled web of social media. He finally found Christopher Avala living in Phoenix, Arizona. Chris was a high school PE teacher and coached the junior varsity soccer team. Marcus found him through a combination of public records and a mutual acquaintance from elementary school who had stayed in the same town long enough to maintain those ancient connections. He didn't call. He didn't email. He mailed the letter to the school address, a physical object traveling across the country. He didn't hear back for 3 weeks. He went about his duties at Fort Liberty, participating in the IG reviews, answering questions with a bluntness that startled his subordinates, and sleeping less than he ever had. And then, one morning, while he was sitting in his car before heading into the office, his phone rang with an Arizona area code. He stared at the screen through 2 full rings, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way that combat had never managed to achieve. He answered on the 3rd ring. "Is this Marcus Kaine?" The voice was unfamiliar. It was the voice of an adult, carefully neutral, carrying the heat and the distance of the desert. "Yes," Marcus said. A pause followed, long enough for Marcus to hear the faint sound of a whistle blowing in the background, a gym class or a practice. "This is Chris Avala," the voice said. Another pause. "I got your letter." Marcus held his phone, his knuckles white. "I know he started, but the words failed him." "It's fine," Chris said. He didn't sound warm, but he didn't sound cold either. It was the voice of a man deciding in real time what register to operate in, a man who had grown up and moved on and was suddenly being pulled back into a hallway from 1998. "I appreciate that you wrote it." Honestly, he paused and Marcus could hear him shift. "I'm not going to tell you it scarred me for life because it didn't. I was a resilient kid. I had a good family, but I'm also not going to tell you it didn't matter because it did. You were very good at making things matter when you were 9. Sounds like that didn't change much." Marcus exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him in a shuddering wave. "No," he said, "it didn't change. I just pointed it at different things." Chris was quiet on the other end, the silence stretching across the miles. "Why now?" he asked. "Something happened," Marcus said. He didn't tell him everything. He didn't mention the classified programs or the specific designation of the woman who had stood in the mess hall, but he told him the shape of it. He told him about the woman, the question she had asked, and the way the room had gone silent because nobody had an answer that didn't make them ashamed. Chris listened without interrupting, the only sound the occasional burst of wind against his microphone. When Marcus finished, there was a long, thoughtful silence. "She asked the right question," Chris said finally. "Yeah," Marcus agreed. What are you going to do with it? Marcus looked out the window of his car at the gates of the base, the place that had been his entire world. I'm going to try to lead differently, he said. Try to actually lead instead of just performing it. Chris was quiet again. Good luck, he said. It wasn't sarcastic. It was plain, the good luck of one person to another who was attempting something genuinely difficult. Thank you, Marcus said. The call lasted 4 more minutes, mostly logistical and brief, and then ended without drama. Marcus sat holding his phone, feeling a particular lightness, the kind that follows the completion of a task you didn't realize was weighing you down until you finally set it on the ground. Meanwhile, the Inspector General's investigation had moved from its preliminary phase into a formal, unrelenting process. Fort Liberty was learning what it meant to have sunlight introduced into spaces that had been kept comfortable in the dark for far too long. The process was not pleasant. It was never designed to be. Investigations of this scale are like surgery. They involve cutting through the healthy tissue to find the rot, and the recovery is often as painful as the ailment. 3 additional complaints came forward in the first 2 weeks. These weren't about Marcus Kaine, but about other dynamics in other units, places where the changed atmosphere of the base had finally made it feel possible, and even necessary, to speak. A supply sergeant in a different battalion was placed on administrative leave pending a review of his conduct toward junior soldiers over an 18-month period. A pattern of informal retaliation in a training company was documented and referred upward. None of it was comfortable. All of it was necessary. Colonel Mitchell attended every briefing personally. He was a man who had built his career on the idea of command, and he was now discovering that command also meant standing in the rain of his own failures. He did not delegate the discomfort. He sat in the rooms where difficult things were said about his installation, and he listened, and he took notes. When asked for his response, he said the same thing every time, a mantra of accountability. Tell me what I need to do to make this right, and I'll do it. The IG investigator was a no-nonsense lieutenant colonel named Ferris. She had spent 12 years conducting institutional reviews and possessed the particular bedside manner of someone who had long since stopped worrying about whether people liked her. At the end of the 3rd week, she sat across from Mitchell in his office. I've conducted reviews at 26 installations in my career, she told him, her voice dry as parchment. Mitchell looked at her, waiting. And the commanding officers usually spend about 60% of these meetings finding ways to explain why the findings reflect circumstances rather than culture, she said. You haven't done that once. Mitchell looked at her, his face weary. Would it help if I did? No, she said. Then there's no reason to. Ferris looked at him for a moment, her eyes softening just a fraction. That's the right answer, she said. Most people take longer to find it. While the high-level shifts were happening in offices and briefing rooms, smaller, more personal reckonings were taking place in the corridors. 8 weeks after the mess hall incident, Rachel Pierce did something that nobody had predicted, including Dr. O'Day, who was paid to predict exactly these kinds of psychological shifts. Rachel requested a meeting with Private First Class Domings. She didn't go through official channels. She didn't use the command structure or the legal team. She simply went to his unit's training bay on a Tuesday afternoon, found his sergeant, and asked where he was. She found him in a storage room in the back, doing equipment inventory. The room smelled of oil and canvas, the air thick with the dust of 1,000 deployments. Domings looked up when she appeared in the doorway, and he straightened immediately, his body snapping into a defensive posture. Lieutenant Pierce, he said, his voice guarded. At ease, she said, though she felt anything but easy herself. She looked at the storage room, the inventory sheets in his hands, and the expression on his face. That look of a person trying to calculate what an unannounced visit from a senior officer could possibly mean. I'm not here officially, she said, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. I'm not here to ask you anything or document anything. She stopped, looking at the concrete floor, then started again. I wanted to say something to you directly without it being part of a report or a transcript. Domings watched her, his eyes narrowed. Okay, he said. Rachel took a breath, the air in the storage room feeling thin. I was in the mess hall that night, she said. You weren't there, but you were the reason it mattered. Domings blinked, his brow furrowing. Ma'am, what you did, filing that complaint 14 months ago, it was the right thing, Rachel said, the words coming out with a sudden, forceful clarity. You knew it was right, and you did it anyway in a system that made it dangerous to do. And then the system made it dangerous enough that you withdrew it. She paused, taking a step into the room. What happened to you was a failure of this institution, Domings. It wasn't a failure of your judgment. She held his gaze, refusing to look away from the discomfort. I want you to know that from someone who was part of the system that failed you. Even if I wasn't directly involved in your specific situation, I was part of the silence that allowed it to happen. Domings was very still. Something was moving through his face, a complex, unresolved emotion that looked like a mixture of relief and old, jagged pain. "Lieutenant," he said carefully, "why are you telling me this?" "Because Dr. O'Day told me that accountability without direct acknowledgement is just paperwork," Rachel said. And she was right. She paused again, the weight of her own words pressing on her chest. "And because I've been making the calculation for 11 years, the one where I weigh whether speaking up costs me more than staying quiet. I'm trying to learn a different way to count." She looked at the inventory sheets in his hand. "You coming forward when you did, it helped make this place safer for the next soldier. I thought that deserved to be said to your face, not in a memo. To you." Domings looked at her for a long moment, the silence in the storage room heavy and profound. Then he said quietly, "Thank you, Lieutenant. It was simple, it was enough." Rachel nodded once, her throat tight, and turned to walk out. In the corridor, out of sight, she stopped for a moment and put one hand against the cool cinder block wall. She breathed, a deep, shuddering lungful of air, then she straightened her jacket and kept walking. That evening, she opened her personal journal, a practice doctor. O'Day had recommended, and Rachel had initially dismissed as insufficiently rigorous. She had started doing it anyway, a private accounting of a changing mind. She wrote 4 words, "The vertigo is changing." She looked at them for a moment, the ink sinking into the paper, then added 3 more. "That's probably good." 10 weeks after the night in the mess hall, Ava Morgan came to say goodbye. She had delayed her departure twice. First for the extended observation period, then for the IG process, and finally for a reason she didn't articulate in her administrative requests. It was a reason that had more to do with the particular quality of what was happening at Fort Liberty than with any formal requirement of her assessment program. She had been to 11 installations in 3 years. She had seen every degree of resistance, every shape of institutional denial, and every level of superficial cooperation. But she had never seen quite this. She found Ethan Brooks where she expected to find him. Not in the barracks or the rec room, but in the small supply room he used when he needed to think. The door was propped open with a wedge of wood. He was sitting on an upturned crate with a notebook in his hands, not writing, just holding it with the expression of someone caught in the middle of a long, complicated thought. He looked up when she appeared, standing immediately. "Ma'am," he said. "Sit down, Private," she said. She came in and sat on another crate across from him. It wasn't the behavior of an official visitor, and they both knew it. Ethan sat back down, the two of them facing each other in the cramped, quiet space. "You're leaving," he said. It wasn't a question. "This afternoon," she confirmed. He nodded. He had known it was coming, expecting it the way you expect a necessary conclusion. You want it to happen because it means the job is done, but you aren't quite ready for the silence that follows. "How's it looking?" he asked. "The base, I mean, your assessment." Ava considered her answer. She didn't want to give him a platitude. "Better than when I arrived," she said. "Not as good as it will be in 6 months if the people who need to do the work keep doing it." She paused, leaning back against the metal shelving. "Mitchell is doing the work." Domings coming forward opened a door that 3 other soldiers have now walked through. "The IG investigation is finding what it needs to find. It's messy, and it's going to get messier before it's clean." She paused again, her eyes catching his. "Kaine is in the hardest part of his process right now. The part where you've dismantled the old structure and you haven't finished building the new one yet. That in-between space, that's where most people stop. They get tired of the ruin and they try to patch it over." "Will he stop?" Ethan asked. Ava thought about the man she had seen in the briefings, the man who had found Christopher Avala. "I don't think so," she said. Ethan looked at his notebook, the cover worn at the edges. He didn't know who Christopher Avala was, but something in the way she said the name told him it was a cornerstone of whatever Kaine was building. "And Pierce?" he asked. "Pierce surprised me," Ava admitted, and she said it with the tone of someone who was not easily surprised and was giving credit where it was due. What she did with Domings, going to him directly, that was her idea. Not O'Day's, not Mitchell's. Hers. That's the difference between understanding a concept and beginning to live it. Ethan absorbed that, the silence of the supply room settling around them. He had been thinking about the last 10 weeks, trying to distill them into something he could keep. "I've been trying to figure out," he said slowly, "what the right lesson is from all of this. Because there are a lot of possible lessons, and some of them are simpler than the truth. I don't want to walk away with the simpler version. Ava watched him, her gaze sharp. What's the simple version? She asked. Don't be like Kaine, Ethan said. Treat people with respect. Speak up when something is wrong. He paused, shaking his head. Those things are true, but they aren't the whole thing. They feel like the surface. What's the whole thing then? She asked. Ethan looked down at his notebook. The whole thing is that systems produce the people they reward, he said. Kaine didn't become Kaine in a vacuum. He became that person because for years, the system around him rewarded what he was doing. The laughing, the crowd, the authority that came from making people feel small, it all worked for him. Nobody stopped him because stopping him cost more than letting it happen. He looked up at her, his voice gaining strength. And changing that, actually changing it, not just punishing the person at the visible end of the problem, means changing what the system rewards. Which means every person in the system has to make different choices, not just the Kaines or the Pierces. It's the people who laughed on Friday evening and went back to work on Monday telling themselves it was just one night. It's all of us. Ava looked at him for a long, silent moment. How old are you, Brooks? She asked. 22, he said. She nodded slowly, a look of profound respect crossing her face. That's it, she said. That's the whole thing. Ethan exhaled, a long breath he felt he'd been holding for months. But how do you change what a system rewards? He asked. When you're 22 and you're a private and the system is enormous and it doesn't even know you exist, you change the 4 feet of it that surround you, Ava said. Her voice was firm, an anchor in the shifting sea of his uncertainty. Every day in every interaction you are consistent and you are honest. You do not make the calculation that staying quiet is worth what staying quiet costs. And you find the person in every room who knows it's wrong before they have the words for it, and you make sure they know they aren't alone. She paused, the light from the corridor casting a long shadow across the floor. And you wait. Because the young private who does that consistently for 10 years, the system looks different around him at 32 than it did at 22. Not because the system changed first, but because he didn't. He changed the environment by simply being a constant in it. Ethan sat with that, the idea of the 4 feet of influence. It made the task feel smaller and yet infinitely more demanding. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was a million small ones. He thought about his grandmother's letter, the paper soft at the folds from being read so many times. He thought about Domings in the commander's office, and Kaine with his cold coffee, and Rachel Pierce breathing against a wall. He thought about a Friday evening that had started like any other and ended like none of them. Where are you going next? He asked. That's classified, Ava said, but she didn't say it with the usual military brusqueness. There was a brief, genuine quality of warmth in her expression. There are 10 more installations on the schedule, she said. Different places, different problems, but the same fundamental question. If you didn't know who I was, why didn't I deserve basic respect? Ethan said, repeating the question that had started it all. Every time, she said. The answer to that question tells you everything you need to know about a place. She stood up, and Ethan followed suit. They faced each other in that small, dusty room, a Navy SEAL with a classified history and a 22-year-old private from Tennessee. The distance between their ranks was enormous, a literal lifetime of service and sacrifice, and yet in that moment it felt entirely beside the point. Private Brooks, she said. Ma'am, the instinct you have, the one that made you speak up when it wasn't going to work, when nobody was going to listen and it was only going to cost you. She held his gaze with an intensity that made him feel as though she were looking at his very soul. Protect it. People are going to tell you it's naive. They're going to tell you the world doesn't work that way and that you'll learn better in time. She paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. Don't learn that particular lesson. Ethan looked at her, the weight of the charge settling on his shoulders. What if I'm wrong sometimes? He asked. What if I speak up and it turns out I missed something? Then you'll be wrong in the right direction, she said. And that matters more than you think. She extended her hand and Ethan shook it. Her grip was exactly what he expected, firm, brief, and entirely a statement. Then she walked out the door, her footsteps receding down the corridor until they were lost in the ambient noise of the base. Ethan sat back down on the crate. He opened his notebook and wrote one line, wrong in the right direction. He looked at the words, then underlined them twice. He closed the notebook, tucked it into his pocket next to his grandmother's letter, and walked out into the base. The work of being a different kind of soldier in a different kind of place had already begun, quietly and irreversibly. 3 hours later, a helicopter lifted off from Fort Liberty's east pad, its rotors beating a steady rhythm against the evening air. Ethan wasn't there to watch it. He was in a training session doing his job, paying the specific, grueling quality of attention to the 4 feet of culture surrounding him that a man with a notebook and a 10-year plan must pay. The helicopter disappeared into the Carolina sky without ceremony, leaving nothing but a fading echo. But in the mess hall where it had all started, something had changed. It hadn't changed because a legend had passed through or because a tattoo had been revealed. It hadn't changed because a colonel had saluted or a phone had gone silent. It had changed because 3 people had chosen, at significant personal cost, to be honest. It changed because one young man had spoken up when it wasn't going to work. Because a 20-year-old private had walked through a commanding officer's door and said a thing that was hard to say. Because a woman had gone to a storage room to deliver an accountability that paperwork could never carry. The strongest warriors are not the ones who can destroy people. They are the ones who protect people when it is unpopular. Ava Morgan had said that once in a room that wasn't ready to hear it. Fort Liberty heard it now, and it would not forget. The sun had finally set, but as the lights of the base flickered on, they seemed to burn just a little bit brighter, illuminating a path that was no longer hidden in the dark.